It was incredibly stuffy in the huge greenhouse. A young pretty girl was working enthusiastically and diligently. She was planting tomato seedlings. She carefully loosened the soil, made neat holes, placed the roots correctly, and then generously watered each bush. Her shirt stuck to her body from the heat. Drops of sweat appeared on her forehead, and the curls of her curly hair, which came out from under her blonde headscarf, were wet through. The older women praised the girl. "Well done, Catherine. You do everything with a conscience, with a soul. You'll make a good hostess. It's time for you to get married, girl. Mary's son Sam's looking at you. You ought to watch him." Catherine could barely straighten herself out. She stretched her tired back and laughed. "Fuck him, you're Sam. I need him. He follows me around and he's a rude, uncultured brute. I don't like him at all. And anyway, I love another man. But it's a secret." Aunt Judy hummed and thought to herself, "What a secret. The whole village knows that Catherine is being looked after by the farmer's son while his parents are out of sight." Catherine finished her work, changed her clothes, washed her face, got on her bicycle, and rode straight across the field to her grandmother's house. The girl from childhood adored this feeling of flight and freedom, when you run, arms outstretched, on the vast golden wheat. Spikelets tickle your feet. You raise your head, and the sky is so blue that it hurts to look, and you want to shout to the whole village, "Hey, hey!" And now she was riding her bicycle. The breeze blew her face and hair, bringing the desired coolness. And there was not a soul around. Catherine saw farmers' jeep speeding across the field. When they equaled, the car braked sharply. A tall guy got out of it. Catherine also stopped, threw the bike to the side of the road, and threw herself into the arms of her lover. He kissed her passionately, pressed her against him, and said, "Hello, my sweetie. Here you are, Bertie. Admit it, mist." Catherine blushed and whispered, "Yes, very much. Tom, when are we going to stop hiding from everyone and tell everyone we love each other? I can't do this anymore. I have the feeling that you don't love me at all, or are ashamed of me," she sighed. The boy began to evade and divert her attention, kissing her neck even more tenderly. "What do you think you're doing, silly girl? Don't you feel how much I love you? When I look at you, I smile. Isn't it bad for the two of us? Look what I bought for you in town. Come on, try it on." Catherine took the bag from his hands, opened and took out a beautiful lace white blouse. She gasped, "Oh, thank you, Tom. What a beauty." She, embarrassed, put the blouse on and coquettishly asked, "Does it look good on me?" "It's the only way to go to the club in a blouse like that. All the girls will be jealous. Let's go out on Saturday, please." The boy started dodging again. "Baby, we can't do it this Saturday. I promised my dad I'd go to a meeting with him. I can't let him down. You should go out, but not for too long, or I'll be jealous." Catherine sighed, but did not interfere with his favorite. She was crazy about Tom, and was afraid of losing him. Couple for a long time more sweethearts. Catherine's heart was ready to jump out. At this moment, she was absolutely happy and forgot about everything in the world. She returned home happy, fatigue like a hand removed. Grandmother realized it at once and began to grumble. "Oh, Catherine, you've been with Tom again. What are you doing? What a shame. He doesn't ask you to marry. He doesn't ask you to marry him. He'll leave you. What will you do then?" "I'll pick nettles and whip you properly." Catherine only laughed. "Granny, don't be nagging. I love Tom so much, and he loves me. Look what he gave me. Isn't it beautiful? I've never had such a beautiful jumper. And you say he doesn't love me. I think he'll introduce me to his parents soon, even though I already know them, but not as a bride, and we'll definitely get married. You'll see. Why don't you let me help you with something?" Let's go water the beds. Grandma did not know how to be angry for a long time. She loved her granddaughter very much, hugged her, stroked her head with her rough hands. But her heart was not in place. She was very worried about Catherine. She realized that they were no match for the farmers, and they would never recognize her granddaughter as a bride. And in the village, rumor spreads quickly. Will all who are not lazy gossip, and then no one will not marry. But Catherine didn't seem to hear her grandmother. She did not walk on the ground, but flew and counted the seconds from date to date. She fell in love with Tom at first sight. Back when she came to the farm to apply for a job, the guy had just brought goods from town and was bringing them indoors. He looked at her, raised an eyebrow, and even whistled. Then suddenly he winked, whispered quietly, "Hello, beautiful. What's your name? I like you." Catherine was terribly embarrassed then and mumbled something unintelligible, and her father sternly shouted at the boy, "Son, stop your stupid jokes, or you'll scare away all the women who work here. What a heroic lover you are. And you, girl, don't look at him. He's not your type. Better give me your documents. We'll be formalized." Catherine, apologist, quieted down, and from that time even did not look at Tom in public, although she liked him very much, so confident, relaxed. But one day, when she was walking home in pouring rain, she caught up with Tom in a car. He shouted, "Hey, beautiful, get in. I'll give you a lift, because you're soaking wet." And Catherine, not expecting herself, sat down in the cabin. She was shivering, and the guy suddenly pressed her to himself imperiously, bossily, and whispered, "Mine you will be, no one will not give you," and passionately so kissed. Catherine was dumbfounded and collapsed in his strong hands. So they began to meet secretly from everyone. Tom was so passionate, so bold, saying he loved only her. She believed, because he was the first man in her life and the first love. Catherine dreamed that soon Tom will tell all the family about their relationship. So she tried and worked hard, wanted to please the future mother-in-law. And soon Catherine became pregnant. She was very afraid of it. She and Tom seemed to be careful, and yet it happened. The girl really wanted this baby. After all, he is from the most beloved man in the world. But she was so scared, she was tormenting herself. What will happen now if Tom's parents don't accept me into the family? And Granny warned me not to disgrace her. I have to tell Tom today. We can't wait to get married now. Tom's reaction to the news was surprisingly calm. "Gee, how could it be? Baby, don't worry, I'm not leaving you. Tomorrow we'll go to the registry office to apply. Parents will start at first shouting, of course they will, but then they will accept." Catherine exhaled and threw herself on the neck of his beloved. "Thank you, Tom. I was so afraid that you left me. You will not regret it. I am the best wife you will become." The couple did indeed apply for a marriage secretly. And in the evening, Tom told his parents everything. There was nowhere to go. It was a wild scandal. The mother screamed so loud the whole village must have heard. "Are you crazy, son? Who are you going to marry? She's a beggar. She lives with her grandmother. She's starving. She's no match for us. We don't know who the child is from. Maybe she's been having fun with someone else. But don't be daft, or you'll have to earn your own bread. Your father and I will deprive you of everything." Tom was stunned. "Mom, what are you doing? I promised Catherine that the wedding at the cafe in a week. I really love her. This is going to be awkward." And then my father spoke up. "I'll handle Catherine on my own. You stay out of it. You've made a mess of things. There's not going to be a wedding. And there's not going to be a baby." I said it. Catherine was happy. The wedding was coming up. Now she would have a real family with Tom. She got to work early the next day. The mood was great, but no sooner had she changed her clothes than the owner appeared at the door. Tom's father, Mr. Carl. He looked at her unkindly and said sternly, Catherine, come in to see me. There's something to talk about. Catherine was not at all surprised, even pleased. She thought he was going to talk about the wedding, but it was a very difficult conversation. The farmer began. All right, Catherine. Tom told us all about your relationship with him. Now, don't think you're the smartest one here, and you're going to get into our family through the bed. I won't. There's not going to be a wedding, that's one. We'll never recognize this child, that's two. Here's the money. You get an abortion, and you leave. The further away, the better. Today, that's three. Do you understand? Now get out. You don't work here anymore. Catherine felt so hurt and humiliated and insulted. But what about Tom? He promised me. We love each other and I already applied. I've never been with a man other than Tom. Why would you do that? I'm not going to kill the baby. It's your grandson. And I don't want either money. Mr. Carl banged his fist on the table so hard that the crockery in the cupboard rattled. If you don't want to be nice, then you'll be sorry. Tomorrow the whole village will know you've been with everyone. You'll get a bad name, and I'll tell them you had a baby. It's up to you how you want to live your life. But you'll never be with Tom. You beggar. Get out, bite your tongue, and take your pay. Catherine cried, took the money, documents, and ran out of the office like a scolded woman. Workers did not understand anything, shook their heads. The girl could not believe that Tom could betray her like that, and she still believed that he had nothing to do with it, and that it was his parents who decided everything for him. She started calling her lover. He didn't answer for a long time, but then picked up the phone and said dryly, "We're not going to make it. Baby, you better get rid of the child and leave. I'm not going against my father, I'm sorry. We've met and that's it. You and me, we've been playing too much." It was a short beep. Catherine sobbed. Her whole life, all her dreams were shattered in an instant. She never dared tell her grandmother about the pregnancy. She imagined how she would worry and scold her. She already had a nervous heart. The girl gathered her thoughts and began to pack in a hurry. She told her grandmother, "You forgive me, grandmother, I'll go to town. I have to. I'll find a job, arrange my life, and I'll write to you and call you. I have money for the first time. I got my pay today. Don't see me off. I love you, Grandma, more than anything in the world." They embraced. Grandma was crying. "What's the matter? I feel like there's something you're not telling me. Did you have a fight with Tom? Why are you traveling in such a hurry?" Catherine could barely keep from crying and forced out a smile. "With Tom and really quarreled. We parted badly. It's hard for me to stay here. That's why I want to leave. Time heals everything. Everything will be fine, you'll see." The old woman understood everything and thought, maybe it's for the best. Anyway, this connection with the farmer's son would not have led to anything good. In the city, maybe her granddaughter will meet a decent guy. She'll make a life for herself. She made a fuss, packed pickles and pies for the road. It was with a heavy heart that she let her granddaughter go. She couldn't say goodbye for a long time. Catherine sat in the train and went, in fact, to nowhere. Tears choked her. Before her eyes stood a veil, and it was so scary. How could she survive alone, and even in a position? How could Tom betray her like that? It turned out that her grandmother was right about everything. He had played and left her. Opposite her sat a full, pleasant woman, very talkative. Word by word, the woman began to tell about herself, about her children, and asked her traveling companion why she was crying. Catherine had nothing to lose, and she too told everything, bursting into tears. Vivian suddenly suggested it. "Listen, I'm just going to work in the city. I work as a cook, week after week at the Cooper businessman's house. They're good, decent people. They pay me well. Well, they're looking for a maid. Do you want to come with me? What if they do? It's a long shot, of course, but I don't know. Don't lie to them. Tell them everything. She's a country girl. Her hands are used to work. They like them like that they work hard and without whims. Catherine jumped at the chance and decided to try. Vivian seemed to her a reliable woman. Such a woman would not lie. An hour later, they arrived at the place. The house turned out to be a country house, comfortable, 2 floors and balconies. Everything was beautiful in the yard, alleys, fountains. The women were met by the owner. Vivian pushed gently confused Catherine to him and said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Michael. I've brought you a maid. A nice girl, country, not lazy, looking for work. Why don't you take her? She's better than the one the recruitment agency just sent over. She didn't know how to do anything. She's so inept. She ruined your shirt and jacket. She's useless." The owner looked closely at Catherine and said, "Well, go to the interview. Let's talk about what you can do around the house. I do not like such young people, and serious you very much. And here we need to work on conscience." Catherine showed her documents and honestly said, "I can do everything around the house, in the garden and vegetable garden too. I can work without a day off. I will not touch expensive equipment without permission. I promise I'll ask Vivienne for everything. But you won't hire me anyway. I can see the way you're looking at me because I'm pregnant, even though I'm still very young. I realize it's a long shot. Who needs an employee who will be gone in 6 months? But I don't want to lie. That's why I left. My fiancé refused the child and told me to get rid of it. And I can't kill a child." The girl even squeezed her eyes shut. "I thought she was going to be thrown out. Who would want a pregnant employee?" But to her surprise, Mr. Michael said quietly, "I sympathize with you, Catherine. Your situation is really difficult. But you're good that you decided to keep the baby. It's a gift from God. It's not given to everyone. I think you'll be lost in the city. I'll tell you what. I'll take you for 3 months on probation. And then we'll see. You can have a live-in maid. There's a guest house. You'll find everything you need. Vivienne will show you around. But I warn you, lazy people and thieves I'll send away at once." Catherine is radiant. Thank you. I won't let you down. I'll work hard. You will not regret that I took me." The girl sincerely thanked Vivienne and the owner for their kindness. She worked the first day, and in the evening they sat in the guest house. Catherine treated the woman to her grandmother's raspberry jam, and the woman told her, "You're the one who made the landlord feel better about your pregnancy. It's a very painful subject for him. He and his wife for many years cannot give birth to a child. They have not traveled to any resorts and clinics and to famous witch doctors, all to no avail. And recently I accidentally heard that they decided to hire a special woman to bear the child, and she will live here, they say. I don't think that's very human. I'm an old school man, I don't understand it, but they know better. Try to stay out of the landlord's business, and most importantly, don't cross the master's wife. She's a nuisance, she's often nagging. But you keep your eyes down, nod and keep quiet, or you'll be out of here in no time. Molly's temper is too severe." Catherine was given a uniform, and she began to work in the Cooper family. The girl tried very hard, had time in the house in order to clean up, and on the flower bed to create beauty. The owner was indeed a pleasant, polite man. But the mistress was very unpleasant. At first all nagged, as if checking Catherine, scrupulously examined the linen and things, looking for flaws. If found, immediately pointed out, drove a finger on the surface of expensive furniture, looking for dust. Catherine, as Vivian had taught her, just nodded and kept silent. She clung to the place and was afraid of losing it. But soon the very same surrogate mum moved in. A young, pretty girl. At first Julia was timid and clearly felt out of place. She was treated like an incubator, special balanced nutrition. even if she did not like it at all. All kinds of vitamins, daily weighing, walks in the fresh air in all weathers. The doctor himself came to their house and examined the surrogate mother. Catherine even felt sorry for her. She realized that if you feel nauseous and do not want to eat, you cannot force yourself to choke on fish. It is a torment. Or drink nasty fish oil when nausea comes to the throat. The girl once overheard Julia asking for spicy cucumbers, and Molly irritably replied that this is a whim. The nutritionist does not approve of spicy food in pregnancy, and no benefit to the baby from it. Catherine felt so sorry for the poor thing. She had a small jar of her grandmother's specialty pickles in her bag. The girl chose a moment when no one sees and slipped them to her while walking in the yard with the words, "Excuse me, these are for you. Eat them for yourself. Don't tell her I gave it to you or the landlady will scold you. I'm pregnant myself and I understand very well." Julia looked at her with such gratitude and replied, "Thank you. I'm drooling, really. I'm salty as hell. They torture me with fresh salads and disgusting fish." My eyes wouldn't look at her. Julia first tried to persuade them to get what she wanted, but they wouldn't listen to her. Then she changed her tactics. She began to dress provocatively. Short dressing gowns, tops, languidly looked at the owner, and in every possible way gave him signs of attention. Apparently, she was deliberately annoying her already nervous wife. And when Molly saw Michael stroking her belly and smiling blissfully, listening to the baby pushing, it was a wild scandal. The landlady was screaming, "Are you guys crazy? Michael, what do you think you're doing? Why don't you two sleep together in front of me? You've got a snake on your chest." The man didn't hesitate to put a stop to the hysterics. "Don't shout, Molly. It's not good for our babies. They can hear everything in there. I'm just talking to them. That's all. Do you want to feel them pushing in there too? It's exciting. To think our little ones are about to be born, 3 of them. Oh, I'm so happy." Julia played innocent and pretended not to understand why her mistress was angry, although in fact she provoked Michael, and Catherine secretly observed all this. Even envied a little. Here will be born children. How they will be loved here, will be nurtured and cherished. They will not need anything. But my baby, except for me, nobody needs anything. And we don't know what's in store for us either. It so happened that Julia's term and Catherine herself was about the same. The girls even sometimes chatted about their fears about pregnancy and the forthcoming labor, but only when no one was around. The birth was about a month away when grief struck the family. The night before, the master had been away on business, returning late. Catherine heard Molly clashing with Julia. They argued about something for a long time. The girl, on the advice of Vivian, preferred to retire to the guest house, so as not to hear anything unnecessary, lest sleep better. In the morning, Catherine, as usual, went to wake Julia. Vivian had already prepared a special breakfast for her, but only she was not in the room, and the bed was disheveled. The girl called the owners, who raised all the household to their ears. It turned out that Julia had run away during the night, having collected only documents and some of her belongings. No one knew where to find her. Michael was desperate. He clutched his head and wailed. "How could it be? Where's Julia gone? We only paid her half of the fee. Does she not need the money? I'll sue her. She broke the contract and she'll pay for it. What if something happens to my kids? I'm about to give birth. What kind of punishment is this? How can you be such an irresponsible fool?" Molly, too, looked upset in front of him. But Catherine realized she was faking it. In fact, this news did not upset her at all. The tension in the family was at an all-time high, and Catherine herself was already unbearable to carry heavy weights and run. Belly interfered, and she decided that it is time to quit, rent a house, and prepare for childbirth. She was paid well and managed to rent a corner. From unaccustomed, When Catherine found herself alone in a small, stuffy room, more like a closet, again came unpleasant memories of Tom and his betrayal. It felt so empty, so dreary. I wanted desperately to go home to my grandmother's village, and there was the complete unknown ahead. And a week later at night, Catherine became ill. Her stomach ached and she was bleeding. She only had time to call an ambulance and open the door, and lost consciousness. She woke up in hospital. The labor was premature and very heavy. The child could not be saved. Barely from the other side of the world pulled the woman in labor. Catherine sobbed, feeling devastated. She was like a beached fish. Her breasts were engorged. Her milk was coming in. She was in terrible pain. She wanted to get out of here immediately. It seemed that absolutely everyone was looking at her with such regret, as a loser who could not give birth to a healthy baby. But they were in no hurry to discharge her. They were treating complications. How unbearable it was to hear from everywhere crying babies, to see the happy faces of women in labor, and to realize that you will never have this happiness again. The girl lay for 24 hours with her back turned to the wall, crying silently. One of the nurses was especially kind to her, pitying her and whispering to her, "Catherine, here's the thing. Together with you almost at the same time gave birth to a lady one. Slim, healthy babies, only they are small. She needed to stay in the baby box to gain weight and get stronger. She should be happy, but no, she did not even want to take the children in her arms, did not look at them, shouted, 'Just give me a paper. I will write a refusal. It's not my children. I do not need them.' She ran away. Just the other day. Could you feed them? You are suffering yourself. Your breasts will soon burst from milk, and poor orphans' breast milk is better than government formula. From it they will get stronger faster." Catherine raised her crying face, swollen with tears, and suddenly asked, "It's crazy, from someone God takes away a desirable child, and someone healthy children abandoned. Where is justice in this world? What's the name of this woman in labor? I'll feed her, of course, I don't mind. At least I'll comfort myself a little. Let me feed other people's babies. I need it now, you know. I'm just torn from the pain of not being able to touch my baby, to kiss him, to hug him. This grief can drive me crazy." The nurse was nodding. "I understand you, my dear. I am a mother myself, and I can see how you are suffering. The mother's name is Julia Morris. Do you know her? Well, maybe she's got relatives, and one of them might want to take the babies. I feel so sorry for them. I can't believe it. They need home care and love, not the walls of the state." Catherine even shrieked. "Of course I know. Their father is on his feet, looking for the children. I'll call him. I'll just feed the kids first. Where to go?" The girl hesitantly took the boy first. He was so tiny, like a toy. She put him to her breast. Surprisingly, the baby immediately took the breast and sucked greedily. What an unforgettable sensation it was, both pain and happiness, and for some reason the tears were choking. Catherine had plenty of milk. The babies were full and she felt very relieved. She sat with them a little longer and agreed that she would come by the hour and feed them. The girl could not tear herself away from the babies, was worried when she held them in her arms, stroked their heads and cheeks. The girl would immediately cover her eyes and fall asleep. The nurses scolded the most compassionate of nurses. "Lillian, what are you doing? Why did you let Catherine feed the babies? Obviously it's good for the babies. No one's arguing. But have you thought about her? What's going to happen to her when she has to leave them? I mean, she just lost her baby. What kind of blow would that be? It could be psychologically devastating." Catherine rang Vivienne the next day and told her everything. Asked her to tell Michael and not Molly. For some reason, Catherine didn't trust her. Within half an hour, Michael was shouting into the phone. "Catherine, you have no idea what you've done for me. What hospital? I'll be right there. I can't believe my babies have been found. I'm the one who got everyone on their feet. But this isn't normal. Julia just disappeared into thin air. And then, miracle. Catherine reassured him. Don't worry, the babies are fine. I go to feed them myself. I have a lot of milk, all enough. You're so lucky. Not like me, I was waiting for my son, I wanted him so much, and he died. And now nobody needs me at all. I'm sorry to tell you all this. It just hurts so much. Michael arrived within the hour. He had a long talk with the head of the hospital, showed him the contract, and they decided to give him the babies. He decided to thank Catherine, to support her somehow, gave her a huge bag of goodies and called back. Catherine, I'm so sorry for your loss. Losing a baby is a great grief. You have to be strong. You've got to pull yourself together and move on. You're still young. You have your whole life ahead of you. I have a proposition for you. Would you like to continue working for our family? Not as a maid, but as a nurse and nanny for my children. I couldn't think of a better candidate. You're a proven, decent, non-conflicted person. I'm sure you'll do well. I'll pay you very well. But if it is painful and difficult for you to contact with children or you do not want to, you can refuse, I understand. Grief after all. The girl replied eagerly. No, not at all, I agree. On the contrary, when I'm with my kids, I don't feel homesick, I feel better. As if there is no loss. And there's plenty of milk, what is there to waste? Thank you. But I also have a favor to ask. My little boy is dead. Can you help me bury him? I don't know where to go. I'm just so scared myself. The businessman understood. He made the arrangements, and Catherine was able to give her little boy a final farewell. She had a proper burial, a church service. It was very important to her. Finally, the babies got stronger and Catherine recovered, and on the day of discharge, all in the maternity hospital froze at the windows. Michael arrived in an expensive car, balloons, a sea of flowers, gifts to the gorgeous midwife. Catherine helped him to carry the children, and he walked beside her, carrying her daughter. Molly looked round with her eyes and asked, "Where's the baby's mummy? Didn't she come? How could it be? Such a solemn day." Michael became sad and replied, "Unfortunately, my wife left on an urgent business trip. There was no way it could be rescheduled. She's coming back tomorrow." "That's all right, we'll get settled in. You'll come straight over, won't you? Can I use your name, Catherine? I'm so grateful to you for everything. You've been a real lifesaver for our kids. I promise you, it's so good to find them. Molly will come back and we'll have a real family, I'm sure." A shopkeeper at a nearby stall was watching with interest. She even opened her mouth in surprise and immediately rang up the farmer's wife, a friend of hers. "Betty, you won't believe who I just saw. Catherine, the country girl who took care of your son. She's being picked up from the hospital by a gorgeous man, and she's had triplets, and he's glowing with happiness. He's putting her in his Jeep, whispering something in her ear. Betty, you shouldn't have chased that girl away. She's got a lot of kids. Did you want them on your son? It didn't work out with Tom, so she got a job anyway. She's got herself a big businessman." Betty turned white with anger. She told Tom all about it. He was angry. He still couldn't get over Catherine. When they met in secret, he thought it was all just fun and adventure, nothing more. But after she'd left the village, he'd often found himself missing her. Other girls didn't please him at all. He wanted to hear her ringing laughter again and see how much she loved him. Now it's over. She's with someone else. And the kids would have to call someone else's man daddy. The guy decided that the triplets gave birth to Catherine herself and was very worried that he had done such a mean thing to her. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to work. She devoted all her time to the babies. Surprisingly, she found it easy to cope. She managed everything. Taking care of the little ones was really a joy to her. In the evening, when the owners came home, they would take the babies for a while. Michael enjoyed coddling them, kissing their heels, bathing them himself. But Molly, on the contrary, tried to be less with them, barely hiding her irritation. Of course, her husband noticed her behavior, and he was very upset. Between husband and wife began to erupt quarrels. Michael would reprimand his wife. "Molly, look how funny Annie is blowing bubbles." And Kevin's holding his own hands. "I can't believe how touching it is," like he realizes they're brothers. "Do you notice how different our babies are in personality? They're quiet." The boys, on the other hand, they're screaming. "Look," he shouts, "honey, take the candy. See, he's growling. Why are you so cold to the little ones? Don't you love them at all?" The wife smiled pretentiously, fussed. She picked up the baby carelessly, but she whimpered even more. Molly immediately put her back on the sofa and began to wail. "Michael, what are you talking about?" "Of course I love babies. I just need time to get used to them. I'm tired at work. I have meetings and negotiations and important things to do, and the nanny does a great job. Let them grow up a little bit. Then I'll take care of them." But Michael had a temper. "I don't understand you at all. Molly, can you even hear yourself? I thought you were going to go on maternity leave and start taking care of the kids now. What do you mean? Let them grow up. No, it doesn't work like that, don't you understand? The kids need a mom, not a nanny. She's just helping us. But Catherine can't replace a parent. Well, this is not the kind of family I wanted." The woman realized she'd overstepped her bounds and immediately made a concession. "You're right. I'll take a holiday tomorrow and stay at home for a couple of weeks. I'll get used to the kids. Things will get better. You'll see, we'll be a real family." Molly did take a holiday and began to pretend to be a model mother. But it was only for her husband. The children grew up. Catherine still breastfed them. But the pediatrician advised to introduce complementary foods, vegetable purees. Molly volunteered to feed them herself. She said she wanted to learn. Even began to walk with the children, took them for a short time, but for feeding again gave Catherine. And she was always on the phone, texting with some Harry. Before the arrival of her husband could disappear somewhere, came back so radiant and happy. The girl began to notice strange behavior in the babies. When they were with her, they were always active, could cry loudly, liked to follow the rattle, smiled. And when Molly brought them back, the babies were lethargic and slept for a very long time. This had never happened before. Catherine was very attached to the babies and loved them with all her heart, so she couldn't let anything bad happen to them. She hesitated for a long time, remembering Vivian's words that it was better not to interfere in the affairs of the owners. Still, she couldn't bear it, and one day she told Michael everything. Surprisingly, he reacted calmly, did not scold Catherine, on the contrary, thanked her. "Thank you, Catherine, that you decided to tell everything. I've noticed a lot of strange things in Molly's behavior lately. I'll have to check it out for myself. You can go." The girl exhaled and decided to be vigilant with her hostess. And Michael, on his day off, while Molly went out with the children, installed small cameras in the nursery and in the kitchen. He decided to check everything and find out how his wife and children behave in his absence. When he looked at the footage a couple of days later, he gasped. Firstly, he was astonished to hear her talking to some man. "Be patient, my love. Don't be nervous. I'll be there soon. I'll just put the kids to bed. If you knew how tired I am of all this. I don't like them. They're strangers to me, that's all. I can't help it. It's good that my husband, a naive man, doesn't realize anything. He wonders as long as the children don't get in the way of the door." And Molly laughed out loud. Michael turned white with anger and clenched his fists. He realized that Molly was cheating on him and bragging about it. Shameless. But that wasn't all. The man saw on the tape how his wife in the kitchen opened a jar of baby puree. She looked around, as if she was afraid that someone might see her. And then she took out a jar and poured some powder into the food, mixed it thoroughly, and went to feed the kids. Michael saw where she hid the jar and decided to take it for examination. They checked it quickly. It was a sleeping pill, and in a decent dosage. Michael couldn't take it anymore. He literally burst into their bedroom, shaking Molly like a doll and shouting, "You traitorous little bitch. I know you've got a lover. How can you cheat on me behind my back like that? You said yourself that you wanted children, and now you've decided to kill our little ones. Why are you giving them sleeping pills? Tell me, or I'll kick you out immediately. We're getting a divorce." Molly wasn't frightened at all. On the contrary, she threw off her husband's arms and stood up. "It's a good thing you found out for yourself. Yes, I love Harry. I'm good with him. Unlike you, he doesn't run around with children like they're treasures. I didn't want 3 kids at once. It's unbearable. They're always crying one after the other, and I can't get my head round it. Not a moment's peace. What kind of happiness is that? Just punishment. I'm leaving you. I've wanted to do it for a long time. What a criminal you found. Did I poison them? So they slept a little longer. What's the big deal? It's a lot quieter in the house. I'm not going to waste my time wiping their noses. I'm a young and beautiful woman, and with you, I'll be a tortured housewife." Molly moved out the same day. Michael frowned. He felt so bad. He filed for divorce and property division. But Catherine and all the servants breathed a sigh of relief. No more torturing the babies. 6 months passed. Catherine had become friends and bonded with the owner. The kids were reaching out to her and babbling something in their own language, similar to the word mom. And Michael began to perceive Catherine in a completely different way. He saw how she sincerely loves the kids. What a good hostess she is. The best mom for kids he just cannot find. So he decided to propose. "Catherine, open the box and try on this engagement ring. Be my wife. You know, after I divorced Molly, I reassessed my life and realized I'd wasted so many years on the feelings of a self-serving man. I made a big mistake. I picked the wrong woman. I used to reason, a wife should be smart, spectacular, so that it was not ashamed to show up in public. So to speak, I chose my own kind. And only now I realized, when you came to us, that the real vocation of a woman is to be a good mother, to have a kind soul and responsive heart. I didn't notice how I fell in love with you. It is with you that I want to live in sorrow and enjoy all my life." Catherine could not believe her happiness. She even cried out of surprise. "Michael, wait. This isn't a joke or a practical joke, is it? I can't imagine my life without Annie, Kevin, and Anthony. They're in my heart forever." "I agree. But let's go to my grandmother's to visit the kids. It's been so long since I've been there. I want to tell you all about it and invite you to the wedding. Is that okay with you? She's the closest person to me. She raised me on her own. She's my mom." Michael, for the first time, shyly hugged the girl and answered, "Sure, let's go even tomorrow. I really want to meet her and sincerely thank her for such a wonderful granddaughter. If you want, we can not only for the wedding, and live with us to invite her. It's a big house, there's plenty of room for everyone. And after all, probably already hard to manage alone in the village house." Catherine kissed the man and pressed herself against him. "You are the best in the world. I've often wondered how she's doing. I'm far away, and she has high blood pressure and high sugar. She'll be so happy when we get there." The next day, the whole family went to visit her grandmother. Catherine's heart squeezed when they drove into the village. Memories of childhood and youth came back. And then she realized that she no longer remembered Tom at all. Michael had finally taken his place in her heart. The locals were curious to see who it was to whom the guests came in such an expensive car. Catherine excitedly opened the creaking gate. Sherrick immediately recognized her, started jumping up, wagging his tail and barking. Granny came out on the doorstep and felt boots and tulip, saw her granddaughter and rushed to her. "Catherine, my darling, what a holiday. You've come at last, and I've been looking out of the window. It's been a long time since you've been home." "Oh, whose children are these?" "My great-grandchildren. They're so cute. And this is your husband. Well, secretive girl, you didn't tell me anything on the phone. And aren't you ashamed? Come in. I baked some fresh bread and soup. Let's have dinner. You must be hungry from the road." The hostess set the table. Everyone began to eat and get acquainted. Catherine was very worried that Michael will not like their country house, because the facilities in the street, dirt around, without galoshes cannot go out. But he, on the contrary, took the trip as an adventure. He ate with appetite, talked with his grandmother for a long time, all told in detail about himself, about his life, about how he fell in love with Catherine. "Oh, an amazing," wailed grandmother. "What a thing, just like in my favorite soap opera. My poor granddaughter, what she's been through in the city. And your little ones are so cute. I don't want to jinx it. I'm glad it all turned out so well, Michael. I'm sorry about Catherine, though. She lost her baby. That's a shame. And she left without telling me she was pregnant. If I'd known she was pregnant, I wouldn't have let you go anywhere. So she's your nanny." "Yes," Michael cleared his throat and got to the point. "Mrs. Melissa, we're not just here to meet you. I'm here to ask for your blessing. Catherine and I have fallen in love, and we want to get married and start a family. Would that be all right with you? She loves the kids so much, takes care of them like a mummy. We're good together." The old lady asked hesitantly, "I'm afraid. What if that woman who gave birth to the children suddenly comes and wants to see the children or starts to harm? Or your ex-wife, who is their mother by documents, wants to take them away? And my Catherine will suffer again. We have to resolve this issue somehow." Michael replied eagerly, "Don't worry, it won't happen. Molly, my ex, didn't like children at all. She didn't want them before, and she didn't want them now. She said she was glad she got rid of them. But the surrogate mom was a fool. She ran away when she was pregnant, broke the contract. She gave up the babies at the hospital." Mrs. Melissa staggered, turned pale, crossed herself and whispered, "What did you say, Julia Morris? It can't be." And then the old woman fainted, clutching her heart. Catherine and Michael were frightened, began to rub her cheeks, splash water, and bring the woman to her senses. Catherine screamed, "Grandma, honey, what are you doing?" "Oh, I shouldn't have told you everything. You were worried about me. You have a heart. I'm sorry. It's all my fault. Come on, wake up." At last Mrs. Melissa came to her senses, drank some water with shaking hands, exhaled, and began to speak quietly. "It's not your fault, Catherine. It's a terrible sin on me. I'll tell you all about it now. You see, Julia Morris is your maternal sister. It's an incredible coincidence. Your mom was a bad girl. I missed her somewhere, didn't watch her. She kept changing boyfriends like a glove. She went to town early. She liked to drink and party at other people's expense. We never really got a job anywhere. She brought you to me first when you were just a baby. You were 6 months old. She repented, saying she didn't know who the father was. She promised to get smart and asked me to come home. But my heart is not made of stone. I forgave her, of course. I accepted her. We started to settle down. My daughter was only home for a week. She was angry. She didn't like the village. And then she asked me to look after you. She said it was urgent to go to town. It was important. But I agreed. What else could I do? And she left for good, left you behind. Of course I took offense at her, But I loved you, Catherine, with all my heart and raised you that way. Then some people told me that Mary got back together with someone else and had another girl a year later, Julia, and her surname was Morris. But she drank more and more, and she went downhill, and she gave the little girl to an orphanage. When I learnt about it, I almost died of shame. I didn't understand how my daughter could do such a thing. Even animals don't abandon their cubs. My first wish was to take my second granddaughter, but then I was afraid. I realized that I could not raise 2 children alone. I had no health, no money, no strength. I hated my daughter, and I still can't forgive her. Mary lived for another 5 years after that, and then she died. Her liver couldn't take it. I buried her, of course, but I can't forgive myself for bringing up such a monster. And I feel bad that I didn't take Julia back. She must have been a mess at the orphanage. I couldn't tell you that. I lied about how much your mom loved you, how she died of illness. I didn't want you to curse your own mother. And now, when I heard Michael tell me who gave birth to his children, I felt sick. How I would like to see my granddaughter, hug her, repent. Catherine was shocked. She hugged her grandmother and comforted her. It's not your fault, Grandma. Everyone is responsible for their own actions. And I'm not angry with Mom anyway, because she gave me the most important thing, life. And your love and affection filled me with warmth and light. I never felt deprived. Thank you, Grandma. I wish I could find my sister too. Surprisingly, we used to talk to her a little while she was in the house. But where to find her now, I don't know anything at all. Michael was silent for a long time, frowning, and then he said decisively, I'm angry at the surrogate mother who turned out to be your sister, but I'd like to find her and ask her why she did such a terrible thing. She ran away on the eve of the birth. I almost lost my mind. I'm worried about the babies, and she made it worse for herself. She never got the money. I still don't understand what was the point of running away if she refused to give up the babies in the maternity hospital. It was a stupid thing to do. You know what? I'm going to hire some detectives to look for her. Maybe we'll get lucky. Catherine was pleased, thanked Michael, and then turned to her grandmother. Grandma, we wanted to make you an offer. Move in with us, the house is big. I will be so calm. I won't have to worry about you, and you'll feel better. I won't have to stoke the stove, walk on the water, carry firewood. The old woman even wept. Oh, thank you, my good ones. And perhaps, I will not refuse. It is so hard to sit alone in the house. It will be more fun, and I'll look after my grandchildren. I can't do it alone, I can't get used to it. But I won't leave Sharik and Lucy the cat. They have served me faithfully for so many years. Michael laughed and replied, That's fine. We don't have to leave anyone behind. We take everyone with us. I've got a big yard, we'll all fit. Mrs. Melissa, you've made the right decision. We'll do our best to make you feel at home. In fact, I wanted to say thank you so much for raising such a wonderful granddaughter, Catherine. We are all one family now and should be close to each other. A week later, Mrs. Melissa was moved into town. Now everyone lived together. The old lady was happy, all admiring the beautiful house and what a cozy room they had prepared for her. The children loved her too. She knew how to get along with them, told them stories, sang songs, and made dolls, amulets. Catherine and Michael were preparing for the wedding. The restaurant was booked. The menu was discussed. Just then they got a call from the detective saying they'd found Julia. She is in their agency, but flatly refuses to meet with Michael. She's afraid he won't forgive her for running away. But her sister she really wants to see and hopes to see her. Catherine was very happy about this news and told Michael, I am going there at once. I will persuade Julia to come to us. She doesn't know that her grandmother is here too. I only ask one thing of you, love. Don't scold her too much. I'm sure she didn't just run away. There was a good reason. And everything's turned out all right. We have a family. The kids are with us. Nothing bad happened to them. Let's forgive her. She's my sister, the closest person to me by blood." Michael sighed and muttered, "I don't know, we'll see." Catherine went to the agency, saw a frightened Julia. The girls, without collusion, hugged each other and cried. Catherine whispered, "Sis, my dear sister, how good it is that you were found, and that Grandma told me about you. You know, that time at Michael's house, we were friends for a reason. I thought it was so strange that we were strangers and we got along so well. Tell me about yourself. I'm curious. Did you grow up in an orphanage? Yeah, I can imagine how hard it must have been for you. What do you remember our mom? What was she like?" "I don't remember her at all. My grandma raised me. She wanted to take you too, but she was afraid she couldn't handle the two of us. I'm sorry, sister. Don't be angry with Grandma. She's been worried enough all her life that she didn't take you." Julia sighed and replied, "I'm glad too, Catherine, that I have you now, my own little person. I don't remember my mom either. All I was told at the orphanage was that she took me there by herself and left me there, that she was drunk and cried for a long time. But I was lucky. I was soon adopted by some very nice people, my dad and mom. Lucy is the one I consider my mom. And I love the woman who gave birth to me and abandoned me. I can't call her mom, I can't. I'm sorry. I don't hold a grudge against Granny, and I really want to meet her. A year ago, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. It was such a blow to our family. My parents are simple people. Mom's an accountant and dad's an electrician. Just a normal family. And we didn't have the money for such expensive treatment. And the chemotherapy that was covered by the policy didn't help my father at all. That's when I decided to become a surrogate mom. I thought I would earn money and help my father. I successfully passed the examination, and I was included in the database. And soon I was approached by businessmen. I guess I didn't realize what I was getting into. It only seemed so simple. I carried other people's children and gave them away. But in life, it's different. It turned out that being pregnant and carrying triplets is very hard. To realize that you have to give birth to babies in such agony and then give them to someone else is unbearable. You feel the babies pushing, you are one with them, and you are treated like an incubator. No more, no less. For some reason, I felt so hurt. It seemed so unfair. I even tried to seduce the children's father out of desperation, and I kept thinking, what a wild thing, I'm going to bear him children, and he hasn't even touched me. But it was like Michael didn't even notice me. Talked only about children, stroked his belly, and dreamed of when he will see his babies. In general, I was not ready for this. And then his wife started to intimidate me. She didn't need kids. She saw me as competition. She was afraid Michael would fall in love with me. And that night, Molly started yelling at me and kicking me out of the house. She threatened that either I would leave voluntarily and disappear from their lives, and then she would pay me a good sum of money, or she would kill me and the kids, find a way to get rid of me. I was scared, and I needed the money. So I ran away. I stayed at a friend's house. My parents still don't know anything, but I did save my dad. I transferred the money for the operation in time. Now he's in remission, getting better. But when my water broke, my friend called an ambulance and I was taken to the hospital. I realized I couldn't show up on the doorstep with triplets in my arms. My dad, if he found out, wouldn't have survived the embarrassment. So I gave up the babies in the maternity hospital and found nothing better than to run home again. I still feel like the worst kind of bitch. I broke the contract, I abandoned the kids, and I cheated on Michael. I'm just confused. I shouldn't have got involved in all this, But what's there to say about it now? So I'm definitely not going. I don't know how I'm going to look Michael in the eye. Wait, Catherine, you are pregnant too. Are you having a boy or a girl? Catherine couldn't stand it and cried, remembering those terrible days. I have none. My little boy died in childbirth, but it so happened that I became first a nurse and nanny for Michael's children. And now I'm a mom too, and Michael's soon-to-be wife. Sis, honey, can I give you some advice? You need to apologize. It's the right thing to do. Michael will forgive you. I'm sure it'll make you feel better. You think about it. And your grandmother's really looking forward to seeing you. So make up your mind and come and visit us. We're a family now. You're not going to hide from Michael all the time, are you? Anyway, we're all looking forward to seeing you, Julia. Now I gotta go, sis. The kids are waiting. By the way, one more important question. Do you regret giving up your children? They are strangers to you by blood, but you gave birth to them. Julia shook her head negatively. You're right. They are not my children. I realized that right after the birth. I didn't want to hold them at all. The maternal instinct didn't kick in. So don't worry, I won't throw a tantrum. And I have no right to them. You're the one who said no. And I'm really glad it was you who became a mom. You're very kind and gentle. The kids will be very happy with you. And I also hope to meet my love. But after everything I've been through, I don't want children, neither my own nor other people's. I'm thinking of taking English courses. I've been dreaming of it for a long time. I'll get an education and find a job. A couple of weeks passed. Catherine was still worried, and her grandmother too, because Julia never came. The girl was very upset. She wanted so much to socialize and be friends. They were not strangers. Michael grumbled. And I knew that this strange one would not come. She's been weird from the beginning. She doesn't want her sister or her grandmother. But one day the doorbell rang. Catherine opened and aghast. On the threshold stood Julia. They embraced. Catherine started to rant. Good for you for making up your mind. Come on, I'll introduce you to your grandmother. Julia looked around. In the playpen, 3 babies were playing happily. They were babbling something in their baby language and were very enthusiastic about the process. The woman looked at the kids and listened to herself, but felt absolutely nothing. Just funny kids, and that's all. Not her children, not her relatives. And that's fine. That's the way it should be. Julia said quietly. Wait, I want to talk to Michael first. Where is he? Maybe he won't even let me on the doorstep. He has a right to. I've done a lot of damage. Catherine led Julia into Michael's office. He was just dealing with the reports. Saw the guest and frowned. Took off his glasses. Catherine tactfully went out. She realized that they needed to find out everything themselves. And she was superfluous here. Julia spoke confusedly and apologized sincerely. I know, Michael. It's all my fault, and I shouldn't have run off like that. But I got confused. And your wife really scared me that night. She said she'd find a way to get rid of me and the kids. So I got scared. Please forgive me. I realized what I did was irresponsible. Michael put his glasses down on the table. It wasn't. I almost lost my mind. Worried about the little ones. Jesus, Julia. But why didn't you tell me right away? I would have told my wife. Yeah, well, what's there to talk about now? Thank God it all turned out well. Thank you, Catherine. Let's consider it a reconciliation. Catherine asked me to. So you're welcome to come round any time, I don't mind. Oh, and one more thing. You may have broken the contract, but I did get the children, albeit with some difficulty. That's why I want to pay you the missing amount I owe you under the contract. To what account shall I transfer the money to you? Julia waved her hands. No, I'm against it, there's no need. I made the deal myself with your spouse. She paid me well for my escape. So you definitely don't owe me anything. It's not fair. I really hope you'll forgive me someday. That's the most important thing to me. After all my adventures, I'm not going to want kids for a long time, and I'm not going to be a surrogate mom for the rest of my life. It's a very heavy burden and a huge responsibility. I wasn't ready for it. Michael could see she sounded sincere and walked over to her, holding out his hand. It's good that you realize that. Okay, peace. Now what now? Go and see Mrs. Melissa. She's expecting you very much. The meeting between grandmother and granddaughter was warm and heartfelt. Both hugged each other and cried. The old woman felt better, and the guilt disappeared. Then everyone had dinner together, and Catherine was happy that now she had such a large and friendly family. Everyone's envy. Elena begged the doctor to put her daughter under a different name, and when she learned the reason MP4. Helen once again admired the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. The girl invariably had a paintbrush in her hands and an easel standing nearby. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her pastime of drawing a love from her early childhood. She always tried to put on paper everything she liked, or, on the contrary, all her thoughts and experiences. She was also very fond of nature. Not a single detail escaped her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable accuracy. Helen's mom could always tell what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left this world so early, hurt her heart. Helen had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the embodiment of femininity and beauty, because it was impossible to consider her otherwise. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Helen idolized her mother, and so did her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Helen's mom madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together which led them to wealth, but unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mom died suddenly and quickly, just one day did not wake up. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone in her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Helen still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl from fear crammed into the wardrobe and did not come out of there until the evening. The realization that she would never have her mother in her life came much later, when she and her father had to set up their lives together. Her relationship with her father was much more complicated, although Helen respected and obeyed him immensely. Hello, Helen. Missy Kate was a kind woman. As she was quite lonely, she was happy to stay with this family. All the more so because she adored the girl. Helen was also very fond of Mrs. Kate, and after her mother's death she grew especially fond of her. And today Mrs. Kate was the first to meet the girl after her walk. "Where have you been?" "Father will be back soon," she said. I was so enchanted by the sunset that I could hardly tear myself away. Helen smiled dreamily. Dreamer. The woman hugged her affectionately. "Go get changed and come down for dinner." After showering and tidying up, Helen went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" he asked, as if Helen had never done so before. "Of course, Papa," she replied affectionately, and followed her father. Mrs. Kate, too, was present at dinner as a very real member of the family. In spite of her strictness, Mr. Sam Smith respected her immensely. "Your birthday is coming up," said the father. "I have a surprise for you." "What kind of surprise?" Helen tensed. It always alarmed her when her father started talking in riddles, hurrying things along. There are still 2 months until your birthday. You'll find out a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session. Father continued the meal in silence. That meant the conversation was over. No one present dared to break the silence, for he was very annoyed by the noise at the table. Helen looked sadly at the portrait of her mother that stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mom was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. And father was much softer under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he had become simply unbearable. Deep down, Helen was even afraid of him. She had learned from Mrs. Kate that her father had serious business problems. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Though where would they come from if her father controlled her every move? Immersed in her unhappy thoughts, she flinched when she heard the phone ring. "My girl, hello, how are you?" It was her favorite aunt, her mother's sister. "I'm fine," Helen replied sadly, but then, when she realized it, she asked cheerfully, "And how are you? 1,000 years have not seen you. I missed you very much." Helen tried to hide the excitement of the call. Memories of her mom broke her soul again. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Emma in the village, and the time spent there had been one of her happiest childhood memories. "That's why I'm calling." Aunt Emma's voice was still happy and cheerful. "Anyway, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say the summer will be hot. We'll go swimming together at the river." But as the question hung in the air, and Helen already saw herself in the village, to give an answer without consulting her father, it would be rash. "Shit, I've got a session to get through. Only then I might be able to come. And I have to agree with my dad." She heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry, I'll do my best." Helen tried to cheer up Aunt Emma. They agreed that Helen would call next week and said goodbye. From the village, Helen had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work much harder than city people, and the labor was mostly physical. But how much beauty they saw every day. A wide river full of fish, vast forests with their gifts, fields surrounding the village on almost all sides, a holy spring gushing from the ground. Helen had come to the little town for the summer to visit her aunt and Mrs. Kate. It had been a long time since she had been in these parts, where she had spent a happy childhood. Nature, springs with crystal clear water, memories came over the girl. For the last few years, Helen had felt lonely. Her father, Mr. Sam Smith, was absorbed in his work, trying to forget himself in it after the death of his wife. Aunt Emma often phoned her niece, especially after the loss of her sister, trying to support her morally, although she was going through grief herself. But Helen needed someone close to her, whose warmth she could feel, who needed her. The school term was coming to an end, bringing closer the inevitable conversation with her father. Helen rehearsed the upcoming dialogue, berating herself for her fear of her own parent. She hadn't seen much of him lately. He was literally sleeping at work. One day the girl managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his study, immersed in his laptop, with disheveled hair and 3-day stubble. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Helen asked timidly, opening the door. Yes, come in," Mr. Smith replied absent-mindedly, keeping his eyes on the screen. Helen sat down in the chair opposite. "Aunt Emma called yesterday," she began quietly. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How's she doing?" Dad replied, not taking his eyes off the monitor. "She's fine. But she suggested something to me, and I wanted to discuss it with you," Helen exhaled. "Discuss it?" Mr. Smith finally pulled himself away from his work and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "All right, I'm listening." "Aunt Emma has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd like that very much. If you don't mind." Father thought for a moment. All right, go have fun. But on one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're going to have a big party." Helen couldn't believe her happiness. She hadn't even expected her father to agree. She jumped up, hugged her parent, and kissed him on the top of his head. Tears glistened in his eyes. "That's it. Go on, daughter. I have to work." Mr. Smith abruptly dismissed her, returning to the computer. Helen left the office feeling inexplicably sad. That evening she phoned her aunt, telling her that she would be arriving soon. A few days later, Helen was already packing her bags, looking forward to her holiday. Despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere on her own. So Helen smiled as she fell asleep on the train to the sound of the wheels. Her aunt met her on the deserted platform. "Helen, how long it's been since we've seen each other." Aunt Emma hugged her niece. "God, you're so beautiful. I can't believe it." After picking up their things, they set off on the motorbike with the sidecar. Driving past a large empty field, Helen admired the vastness and wildflowers. It had been a long time since she had seen such picturesque scenery. The warm rays of sunshine were folding into quaint islands, making her imagination plan their arrangement on the canvas. A gentle breeze blew her hair out of her braids, and despite the intense heat, Helen was incredibly happy. "Go into the hay, darling," said her aunt. "It's much cooler in here. It's very stuffy in the hut." After unpacking, Helen stepped out onto the porch and looked at the familiar but almost forgotten shapes of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since the days when she had visited with her mother. "Let's go to dinner, dear." Emma put a hand on her shoulder. Helen brushed away a tear and followed her aunt. Lunch was to be in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father had never eaten outdoors, even though their garden was beautiful, preferring to eat at home. And here, dining outdoors seemed so natural that Helen ate even more than usual. "If this keeps up, I'm afraid I'll have to change my wardrobe," she laughed. "You can't spoil your slim figure," Aunt Emma flattered her. After a little silence, she added, "I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for?" Her niece hastened to reassure her. "I knew how badly you felt about your mother's death, but I never called you to me. You see, I was afraid. I was afraid that seeing you would make me feel worse. You know how close we were to her. I'm sorry for my cowardice. I only now realize how wrong I was." Emma was silent, and large tears rolled down her apron. Helen rushed to comfort her. Together they shed many tears until almost evening, and when they had calmed down, they began to stoke the village bath. The whole atmosphere of the place had a calming effect. For a moment, Helen even felt her mother's presence. "Tomorrow they promise a terrible heat wave. Shall we go swimming with you at the lake?" Auntie suggested it. Helen agreed without a second thought. They talked a little longer, and then went to their rooms. But sleep did not come, so the girl decided to go out on the porch, taking a plaid. Despite the hot days, it was a little chilly at night. The fence at her aunt's house was rather nominal, very low, so passers-by could easily see what was going on in their yard. Sitting down on the porch, Helen looked up at the sky studded with thousands of stars, and it seemed that even the sky here was quite different, not like in the city. Suddenly she heard a noise. At that time, a group of young men and girls appeared from around the corner. The guys were with a guitar, occasionally strumming the strings. Helen smiled at them. And suddenly she also wanted to give herself up to the impulse of youth, to have fun and party until morning, like most of her peers. But her father suppressed all her dreams and desires at the root. He even got angry when he saw her with a canvas and brushes, to say nothing of moonlight walks with the boys. Suddenly the company stopped in front of their house, and one of the guys stared at the girl sitting on the porch. Her long, dark hair fell down over her shoulders, and her fair porcelain skin inevitably drew the eye. Helen, embarrassed, looked away. "John, come on," shouted one of the girls, and the company moved on. The young man glanced round once more, but his friends quickly pushed him forward. Helen smiled to herself. So many new impressions she had never experienced before, and here in just one day. Waking up at dawn, the girl took her easel and went out into the courtyard, where there was a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, she hurried to help her aunt with breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. Freedom of movement thrilled her wildly, and passing through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Settled in?" Aunt Emma asked. "Yes, a bit of nature here, of course, is marvelous," shared Helen's impressions, though Auntie saw everything perfectly well herself. Those burning merry eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Helen was a bit stiff, as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This isn't the city. There's real space here," the woman replied thoughtfully. After a quick snack, they grabbed a few things from home and put them in a basket, grabbed their beach gear, and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor that presented itself to the girl's eyes was astonishing in its immensity. The lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. "Perhaps the scenery here is as good as any overseas resort," smiled Helen. "I wish I'd brought my easel. You'll have time, believe me. But today, let's sunbathe and swim," said Aunt Emma, nodding towards the blanket she had spread out. Helen took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimming costume. She had bought this item of clothing in advance, knowing that she would be swimming in the local pond. Suddenly, the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning round, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly, examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Helen uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Emma and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working. So she glanced round at the group. Suddenly, one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Helen looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying a little under the rays of the hot sun, Helen and her aunt took a dip in the water. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where the same company was resting. But that fellow Helen did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to the auntie's story, the reason for this was due to underground springs running directly into the lake. Having thoroughly enjoyed their swim, Helen and Aunt Emma did not return home until near evening and immediately began to prepare dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a great time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "I haven't had proper company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with longing. But time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And although fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and it's been a long time since I've felt as wonderful as I do today." Aunt Emma brushed away her tears. Helen rushed to comfort her. "Maybe you'd better move in with us. We have a big house and Daddy I don't think would mind," the girl suggested. "No, honey, my place is here. I've got my soul attached to it. This is where I'll end my journey. But I want you not to forget this place either. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Helen answered nothing, pressing Aunt Emma to her bosom. She stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands were poking out. After enjoying the cool of the evening, they returned to the house. It was getting dark, but Helen didn't want to go to bed. She went out on the veranda and took a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she gazed at the stars and dreamed. When she heard the creak of the wicket door opening, she shuddered. On the path directly to her walked the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. Sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice," he pronounced. "Didn't know when I'd be able to see you again." John looked Helen straight in the eye and smiled. "These are for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Helen accepted them, giving the young man a radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you'll have to introduce yourself," she said, trying to hide her excitement. John, the young man, answered immediately. "And you are Helen, aren't you?" "How do you know?" she wondered. "I had to find out." The boy smiled. Helen noticed the shadows in the window of the dark room and knew that Mrs. Kate was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Wouldn't your girlfriend be unhappy that you'd come here?" Helen decided to ask, for the question had been on her mind ever since she had seen them. "I've been cuddling with Anne for a month on the beach. I don't have a girlfriend. Anne's just a friend. We rent a house near you. For the second summer in a row, there are 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We're all studying together at one of the universities in town. And this place was an accident, but we fell in love with it unconditionally." John's voice was so pleasant that Helen was ready to listen to it all night. At last the tension between them disappeared, and Helen even dared to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Helen immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, John returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Mr. Sam Smith asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this argument," replied John. "We'll see," said Ben. He had put John up to the bet while they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "Nice girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to turn her eyes on the average bloke. That girl's out of your league, bro." But John looked at her with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really did like her very much, but his friend's words hit the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine," he said eagerly. "Want to bet?" Ben immediately got into the game. They said nothing about the bet to the rest of their friends, and only Anne heard everything. She was very fond of John, and she was following him around, dreaming of getting him. But the boy seemed to ignore all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him go to Helen. Resentment and anger were very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Helen greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She stretched sweetly. She smiled as she remembered last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast," her aunt called her affectionately. "5 minutes and I'll be ready," Helen said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing, she entered the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I haven't helped you at all," she apologized. "Stop it. It's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know that you have someone to take care of you," she said. Feeling that she might cry at any moment, she decided to change the subject. "By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight." She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. "Yes, that bloke we saw at the lake came round. He wanted to meet me," Helen said, and a blush covered her face. "Well, I hope he succeeded," replied the aunt. "He did," she said, blushing even more. "Only I don't know how to behave with boys," she confessed. "You don't need to know anything. If you like him, you should behave as your heart tells you. Just be yourself," the woman replied. At 12, they had a lot of things to do, so Helen was only able to free herself by evening. And just as she entered the house, she heard a quiet knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Helen was sitting on the veranda with Mrs. Emma when John came up to them with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. "Thank you," Helen smiled, accepting the bouquet. "How about a walk around the town?" "I don't know," the girl replied excitedly. "I need to shower and change, but I really want to walk with you." "Great. I'll wait for you on the porch," John said. "I hope your aunt doesn't mind?" Helen shrugged her shoulders. "I guess not." When John came out, she rushed into the shower, wondering what she should wear for the walk. Once ready, Helen smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. John was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Emma. They were drinking tea and chatting sweetly. Helen, the aunt, appealed as the girl approached. "This young man asks permission to take a walk with you. I had to meet him so I could let you go in peace." Helen looked at her questioningly. "I see he's a nice chap, so I'm letting you go." Noticing her niece's tension, Mrs. Emma hurried to leave them alone. This day, John behaved more easily than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Helen learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a specialist in cardiology. She, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "That's great. Can I see your paintings?" John asked with interest. "They are all left at home, in my studio. But I could paint a picture especially for you," Helen suggested. "That would be great," said the boy. John behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself too much. The walk ended in the late evening, leaving both only positive emotions. From that day, the young people were inseparable. John had been picking up Helen since morning. They returned sometimes in the morning. Mrs. Emma did not hinder their meetings. On the contrary, she liked John very much. Besides, she could see that her niece was truly in love. Helen felt that John was her man, and even if he was not rich, that was not the main thing. The main thing she realized was that he had the same feelings for her. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Helen tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could no longer imagine themselves apart. "It's the first time I've been like this," said John, sitting on the shore of the lake, which has become their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had other girls before, but this is nothing like what I feel for you." John pulled Helen to him and kissed her gently. "What about Anne? Did you go out with her too?" the girl asked with a smile. "No, although I know her desire to be with me. But now I don't need anyone but you," the boy said, looking Helen straight in the eyes. "I will love you always. No matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. The girl was a little embarrassed, for it was the first time she had heard such words. Nevertheless, the holiday was coming to an end, bringing closer the time of the inevitable parting with her beloved and with this beautiful place. It seemed as if Helen had never really lived before this trip. Although she and John had agreed to meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left her. "Tonight is our last night. You'll be gone tomorrow," John said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again," Helen smiled, snuggling into the boy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a hill surrounded by pine trees. They had a beautiful view of their favorite lake. John had brought a blanket and a basket of picnic supplies. "I love you very much," he said, "as much as I possibly can." Helen looked John straight in the eye as she confessed her love. There was no doubt of her sincerity. She gently touched his lips with her own, pressing herself against him. That was the day they decided to spend the night together. It was their last meeting. This time their date didn't end until dawn, and in the evening Helen already had a train ticket. "I'll definitely come to see you off," John whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Helen remembered her promise to give John the painting. By the way, it was ready. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. Slowly gathering herself, the girl grabbed the gift and headed towards the house where John and his friends lived. As she got closer, Helen felt an incomprehensible excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened for her by Anne. "Could you get John for me, please?" Helen asked. "John's gone to town, didn't you know?" Anne looked at the bewildered Helen with undisguised gloating. "Why should he have to answer to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Helen sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. "What's there to understand? John and his mates bet that he'd sleep with you. You seemed so unapproachable at first. And then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Do you understand?" Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She could feel that John loved her. Was it really possible to play at being in love so skillfully? She heard Anne say something else to her, but she hurried away. Waiting for the train on the platform, Helen looked at the faces of the passers-by, hoping to see the face she loved so dearly among them. She hoped that he would come, explain everything, hug and comfort her. But time passed and he was still gone. "Sweetheart, what's the matter with you? Your face is gone." Her aunt, who was seeing her off, was worried. Of course she understood who her niece was looking for in the crowd. "It's all right. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful holiday. If it hadn't been for you." Helen stammered and cried, throwing herself around her aunt's neck. A few minutes later, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. V. He never came. Helen's mind was spinning as the train moved off. So Anne was telling the truth, she concluded. She had time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that everything had happened exactly as Anne had said. How else would she have known about their intimacy the day before? Thinking about the fact that John had told his friends about it with ease, perhaps in great detail, was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment was slowly being replaced by anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform and carefully put her things into the car. At home, she was met by the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Helen that the holiday had been just a dream. A note from her father on the table in her room said she would see him tonight and have some important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Helen barely held back tears. Suddenly she realized that she had no one at all to share her worries with. A little later, Mrs. Kate came in. She missed her pupil sincerely, and so did Helen. But there was something about her behavior that was unsettling. The woman cast pitying glances in Helen's direction, and when asked, she was careful to change the subject. Her father came late in the evening when Helen had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and receiving a negative answer, entered quietly. As Helen sat down in the armchair opposite her daughter, she realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment she wanted to throw herself into his arms, to cuddle like a little girl. But when she assessed the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle in his face betrayed any emotion when they met. Helen's heart clenched as she glanced at her mother's photo. Helen dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up," said her father. "I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. There will be a lot of important people there. I'll introduce you to a lot of people." "Thank you. But why do I need these people?" The girl timidly objected. "I'd rather celebrate my birthday with my family." "That's out of the question. I've made up my mind. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You have to outshine everyone. You have time to get ready." My father got up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Helen sat down with her legs tucked up. Her phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was from Aunt Emma. She was worried. Helen smiled. She hadn't received such warmth in a long time. Communicating with her aunt helped to take her mind off her unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to shine through. Helen sighed heavily as she looked out the window. The weather completely reflected the state of her soul. Every minute she thought of John and what he had done. Her heart leapt out of her chest and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Helen went to her little workshop. There she was finally able to distract herself. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Helen wrote a portrait of her lover, who broke her heart. Helen did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Helen looked down and was startled to see that her father had clearly been drinking, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, all right," Mr. Sam Smith shouted. "To sell the factory is to admit bankruptcy. I'll find a way out." Helen tried not to let her father see her like this. It was the first time she'd ever seen him drunk in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Helen thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior otherwise. Slowly, the girl made her way to the kitchen, so as not to run into her father. She began to wait for Mrs. Kate. "Helen, what are you doing here at this hour?" the woman asked with a surprised raised eyebrow as she entered the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a little overworked lately. I guess he decided to relax," the woman said quickly, not looking at her. "He's drunk out of his mind. I've never seen him like that. What happened? Do you know anything about it? I'm the only one who doesn't know." "I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late," Mrs. Kate tried to end the conversation quickly. Helen didn't sleep well that night. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. John's face and Anne's haughty face came to mind. That's why she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Helen resolutely went in search of him in his study. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was ajar, and she ventured in without knocking. Mr. Sam Smith sat leaning back in his chair, thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent this night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Helen?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope for your support. The beginning did not bode well." That's why Helen inwardly tensed up. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy. Plus, I'm in massive debt. What to do about it, I don't know yet." Helen sat there completely bewildered. She didn't know what to do next. But one thing was certain: she had to make arrangements for her future. Mr. Sam Smith paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up," he said. "As promised, I'm going to give you a big party." But Papa, Helen wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic and smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need this holiday at all, that it wasn't worth spending money on it, which was scarce now. But her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled," he said. "Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. This evening I will introduce you to your future husband." Helen was so shocked that she was speechless for a while. Only after a few minutes did she speak in a quiet voice. "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I'm a free man, and there's a man I'm in love with. So your plans aren't going to work out." Helen looked defiantly into her father's eyes, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no reply, so she got up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she had ever objected to her father, so it made her feel sick to her stomach, and even more so that he had decided to control her fate without her knowledge. When she opened the only photo of her and John in her phone, she cried. For the next few days, she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid talking to her. From Mrs. Kate, she learned that he came late from work and almost always drunk. The time on the calendar was approaching the day of her birth. One night before going to bed, Mr. Sam Smith came to make up with his daughter. He spoke so softly and was as affectionate as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was alive. "All I'm doing is looking after you, darling," he said. "I don't want you to be on the street, because anything could happen. Michael's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you for a long time, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious fiancé, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked till nearly midnight, and Helen promised to think hard. In the morning, when it was barely dawn, she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew that she would be awake by now, for in the village the time was very early in the morning. "Helen, my girl, how glad I am to hear from you," said Aunt Emma. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. There was so much I wanted to say and ask, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. "How are you doing? Why are you silent?" Aunt Emma asked warily. I don't know," Helen said and cried. She was rambling, but she recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Did John ask about me? Had you seen him?" Helen asked timidly. "No, I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," said her aunt. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. But you can't marry against your will. It's like the Stone Age." She resented it. After a little talk with her aunt, Helen began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Her aunt promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be all right. She did call back, but this time the conversation didn't bring Helen any comfort. Aunt Emma confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at Michael and not to be too hasty. Helen was surprised at the change in Aunt Emma's mood, for now everyone was against her. On the eve of the party, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear in front of the guests. Helen absolutely did not want to have any fun. Every night she locked herself in her studio. She expressed all her pain and longing in her paintings. Her thoughts took her back to the short time she had spent with her lover. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. She and her father arrived at the restaurant just in time. Many strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but she had to hand it to her father, for he stayed with her almost the whole evening. Looking at the faces of the guests, Helen wondered which one of them was Michael. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow tune began to play, and couples began to walk out into the center of the room. Looking round, Helen didn't realize she was alone. Her father had discreetly disappeared somewhere. "Would the birthday girl do me the honor of dancing this slow dance with me?" Helen heard a man's voice behind her. Turning round, she saw a man who, smiling, was staring at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he drew her imperiously to him and drew her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Helen waited impatiently for the music to end. After all, the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, It is a pleasure to welcome you to the birthday party of my only and favorite daughter." It was clear that Mr. Sam Smith had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and Michael." The guests clapped and some even started whistling. Helen was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that Michael is my companion from today. Please love and welcome him." A satisfied smile was on the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself, and what was happening brought him pleasure. Helen was the only one in the crowd of guests who felt like an extra at the party. She looked at the groom and sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not what she had imagined the groom to look like. She had thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. That was what Mrs. Kate tried to assure her every evening, telling her various stories about people she knew. "Patience is the best medicine, Helen. In the old days, nobody asked anybody about love. The bride and groom's parents would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family," the woman said. "Well, that was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love," Helen objected. "And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other?" Helen asked Mrs. Kate. "Well, how can you not like me? You can't find a beauty like that anywhere." But little by little in the course of such discussions, Helen herself began to set herself up for a favorable outcome. "After all, if he disgusts me, it's not by force that my father will force me to marry," thought the girl. And now, standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or perhaps 15 years older than she was, Helen found herself at a complete loss. Someone was coming up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. John's face came back into her imagination, so dear and beloved. And that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, clasping her as if she were his property. She got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Helen sat on the sofa in the lobby, letting the tears flow freely down her cheeks. Making sure no one was around, she didn't hold back her emotions. Tears of joy? Hearing a woman's voice, Helen turned around. Standing next to her was a pretty slim brunette with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, I'm Helen. I don't know what to say," she said, addressing the stranger. "It's okay, don't apologize," she said. "My name is Caroline." She extended her hand for a handshake and smiled. "Let me offer you a glass of champagne in honor of our acquaintance." Helen nodded. "Why not? A little relaxation and distraction wouldn't be a bad idea right now." At a table in the far corner of the room, the girls chatted casually. "You're a good girl," Caroline said. "Honestly, I thought you were arrogant, considering who your father is." Helen just smiled back, unable to find anything to say. "And my fiancé dumped me today," Caroline said with a sigh. "Can you imagine, he just said that it was over between us, and that he was going to marry someone else. How could he do that? You're so beautiful." Helen tried to console her. "I guess money is everything in this life. No one needs love anymore," Caroline said sadly. "But I believe in love, and so do you. He'll regret what he did, and he'll come back." Helen had no sooner finished than she noticed Mr. Sam Smith and Michael approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Caroline rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving," she replied, standing up and heading for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Helen asked her father sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list," he replied. "Don't worry, dear, I'm just keeping you from unnecessary contact," Mr. Michael added with a strained smile that looked more like a grin. Let me decide for myself what socializing I want and what I don't want, Helen objected rudely. Apologizing, she followed Caroline, but to her dismay, the girl had already left the restaurant. Helen spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid everyone, including her own father. She was anxious to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Helen was relieved when she went into her room and sat down on her bed, completely exhausted. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation was bound to happen. That was what Helen decided as she fell asleep. Waking up, and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed for her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk," Helen began abruptly. Her father looked at his daughter in bewilderment. This was a tone she had never used with him before. "I don't want to marry Mr. Michael. Please let him know that," she said. "The matter of your marriage is settled and non-negotiable," said her father again. "Michael is a very promising young man. You'll get on well with him." "Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am," Helen objected. "Besides, I don't like him at all. Arrogant and presumptuous. I don't want to marry him, Papa." "He couldn't help it," he shouted. "Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we might end up on the street," Dad said. "So I'm concerned about your future." "It's a pity, Dad, that for the first time in my life I'll have to go against your will," Helen said quietly. "I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten how happy it is to live with someone you love?" She knew she had touched a sore subject. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to talk about such topics. Suddenly, he sank into a chair, lowered his head, and sobbed. Helen was shocked by what was happening and did not know how to behave. "I always loved your mother. I worshipped her," he said through his sobs. "And believe me, I haven't forgotten what happiness is like. After losing her, I concentrated on my work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that had settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success. Things have been going from bad to worse lately. My competitors have been investigating me. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are calling in debts, and I can't pay them. Michael offered to work with me and help me financially. He has a lot of connections in all the agencies, and in return he wanted to be my son-in-law." Her father looked her straight in the eye. "Please, my daughter, agree," he pleaded. "Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm." Helen silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint furiously, without stopping for a moment. She didn't come out until the next morning. A worried Mrs. Kate was waiting for her. "Helen, what's the matter?" she asked. "I'm all right," she replied dryly. "Tell my father that I agree. Tell him to start preparing for the wedding." As the door closed behind Mrs. Kate, Helen spoke aloud, looking at her mother's picture. "I'll do what he wants for you, Mum. I don't want him to suffer for using me as a bargaining chip. Let that be on his conscience." From that day on, Helen became completely indifferent to everything that happened next. The days passed in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations were of no interest to Helen. She saw Michael twice more when he came to see her father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Helen stood in her gorgeous wedding dress, trying to fight back tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The fact is that a fortnight before the planned celebration, Helen learned that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that in this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby is her salvation from loneliness. That the father of the child, John, there was no doubt, as Helen was no one else Helen was close to. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would be a part of the man she loved. Helen did not want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would Michael feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Helen tried not to think about that for now. She was worried about Aunt Emma's absence at the party. She was the person she most wanted to see. But neither her father nor Mrs. Kate could explain clearly why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent in all Helen's attempts to reach her. The groom socialized more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under the shouts of bitter, he roughly grabbed her for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. It could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Only he, unfortunately, got so drunk at the end of the evening that he fell asleep on the sofa in the restaurant lobby. Helen couldn't help but feel relieved that she would have to spend the night alone. But to her surprise, the next day Michael did not show any interest in her. On the contrary, he deliberately went to bed in another room, dropping a greeting as he went. He made no further conversation with her. Helen didn't know how she should react to this behavior. On the one hand, she didn't want to be intimate with her husband, but on the other hand, she wondered why he was trying so hard to make her his wife when now it was as if he didn't notice, or even ignored her. There were more questions than answers. So after a few days of tense silence, Helen decided to talk to her husband, which she later regretted. Waking up before Michael, she hurried to the kitchen and made him coffee. After making a simple breakfast for herself, she poured tea and waited for her husband. Michael came downstairs and caught Helen's questioning look. "You didn't have to strain yourself," he said. "I never have breakfast at home." Having said that, he took the cup with the coffee prepared for him and defiantly poured it into the sink. "What's going on? Will you bother to explain why you're avoiding me?" "I don't understand anything." Helen tried to speak calmly, so as not to give away her excitement. "Don't fill your pretty head with unnecessary things," dear Michael said playfully. "And don't have any illusions about my great love. You are only a good investment in my capital." Having said that, the man turned round and left. Helen felt as if she were chained to the chair. She had thought that if she didn't fall in love, she could surely be a good friend to her husband. But now? For the next few days, Helen hardly left her room. The constant nausea and bouts of dizziness were unrelenting, and every bite she ate was asking to go out. So she tried to lie down more, occasionally sending maids for tea or milk. She had not yet seen a doctor, but she was determined to do so when she felt better. But everything was decided by chance. One evening, without waiting for the maid to come, she decided to go down to the kitchen for tea. Helen felt sick and fainted before she reached the dining room. The maid came running to the noise, followed by Michael, who had recently returned from work. Helen woke up in her room. Nearby were Michael and a man in a white coat. "You're awake, my dear," the doctor said affectionately. "How long has it been with you?" "Not very long," Helen answered reluctantly and turned away. "Well, it's all clear. Congratulations, Mr. Smith. Your wife will soon give you an heir," the doctor said cheerfully. "That's very interesting," Michael said thoughtfully. "Thank you, doctor. I think you should go now. I'd like to be alone with my wife," he said to the doctor in a tone that did not tolerate objections. A moment later, they were alone. Helen held her breath, waiting for accusations and possibly a divorce. "Get some rest. I won't bother you," Michael said. "Tomorrow you'll go with the driver and register at the antenatal clinic. And also don't forget that you need to eat a full meal and be outdoors more often." And for the first time kissed his wife on the cheek. Michael went out. Helen's thoughts were jumbled in her head. Michael's actions did not fit with their last conversation. The fact that the child was not his was clear to everyone, but he didn't show it. And even when the doctor left, he didn't change his tactics. The next day, Helen went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The term turned out to be almost 3 months, exactly how long it had been since she had last seen John. The girl tried to chase away the thoughts of him, because they necessarily caused tears and worries. And she couldn't be nervous now. Having plunged headlong into the expectation of the baby, Helen almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband. And there were strange behaviors. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without her driver. It was only when she went to her father's house that she was able to be away from the eyes that were always watching her. Helen lacked communication, and so, finding one day in the pocket of her coat a note with Caroline's phone number, the girl was overjoyed and immediately dialed the number. "Caroline, it's Helen. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember," Caroline answered quickly. "How are you? Would you like to meet?" "I'd love to," Helen replied. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls chatted a lot about everything. It even seemed to Helen that they had known each other for years. "So how do you like marriage?" Caroline asked timidly. Sighing heavily, Helen replied, "I don't know. We're strangers, and we don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Helen felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be Michael's wife," Caroline said. "Maybe, but not me. The day I got engaged, I saw him for the first time. And my father had already made up his mind for me. And even though my heart belongs to someone else, I can't betray my father. It's important to him. And he's the only family I have," Helen said sadly. Caroline was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Helen had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "Who did you see yesterday?" he asked as soon as Helen came down to breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Helen looked into Michael's eyes. His hard stare made her uncomfortable. "Here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked in a raised tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Helen shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I'm not your property, Michael." "You're wrong, darling. And soon you will be convinced of it." Her husband smiled haughtily, reminiscent of a grin. Helen silently stood up and went to her room, wiping her tears. The following evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. This couldn't go on any longer. Entering her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think such a thing?" "Imagine I could. I can't live with Michael any longer, so I'm asking you to settle your business matters, after which I'll file for divorce." It took a lot of courage and effort for Helen to talk to her father like that. Deep down, she felt insanely sorry for him, but no less sorry for herself. "All right," replied her father at last. "But I need a few months to sort things out because your husband has half the shares in my firm. Be patient for a while and then do what you want." Father waved his hand and walked out silently. He never came down for dinner. In vain they waited for him with Mrs. Kate. "Oh dear, I don't like this," said the woman, sharing her worries. "Mr. Sam Smith has been drinking a lot lately, smoking a lot, and not sleeping much. He must be in a bad way." "That's odd. He told me that things had improved since the wedding," Helen thought. The next day, Helen phoned Caroline to arrange a meeting, but she refused, citing illness. Her voice trembled. Helen was alarmed by this, so she decided to visit her friend, taking all precautions. After all, it was absolutely impossible for her to be ill right now. The driver took her to her father's house, and from there, coming out through another entrance, Helen took a taxi to her friend's house. The appearance of the friend struck Helen. Who did this? She pointed to the huge bruise and bruising on Caroline's cheek. It doesn't matter. You don't know him anyway. Caroline brushed it off and went to put the kettle on, making it clear that she didn't want to discuss the subject. Helen didn't press her friend. When she wants to, she'll tell you, she thought. There were men's things in the flat, although Caroline had said she lived alone. After chatting for a while, Helen left her friend and drove home. She couldn't be late, or Michael would suspect her of lying. She was frankly afraid of him lately. Of course, he hadn't done anything bad to her yet, but sometimes he looked at her like that, or spoke in a tone that sent shivers down her spine. So Helen decided not to make her husband angry. In the evening, Michael said that one day his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope I am understood." Helen nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Helen wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, although it was hard not to notice the belly, which was growing every day. On Helen's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As Helen went down to the table, she heard the sound of voices coming from the living room. Apparently, Michael had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the clearest. For a moment, Helen froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar to her. Her heart pounded frantically. Her legs became cotton woolly. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother." "My wife, Helen," Michael introduced her. John stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, John," he said. Behind him stood Anne, smiling wryly. For a moment, Helen thought she was going to faint. "Are you all right? You don't look well." Noticing the pallor on her face, John asked. "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon." Michael laughed. "Congratulations," John replied quietly. "Well, let's go to the table," he said. John found himself across from Helen at the table and kept his eyes on her. Anne was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, Michael, that we couldn't come to your wedding. John is literally obsessed with his studies. And after he was invited to work at the cardiac center, I don't see him at home." Anne gave John a defiant hug, glancing defiantly at the pale Helen. "I hope you'll come to our wedding." "And how soon will it be?" Michael asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it," John cut in. Anne was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by the words. When it was time for the hot meal, Michael suddenly shouted, "Well, who do you think will eat this rubbish?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the roast turkey. "I thought everyone would like it," Helen replied, confused. "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." Michael couldn't stop himself. Apparently, the strong drinks were doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a great respect for turkey." John stood up for Helen. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and walked quickly to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like that, and even a pregnant wife? Hasn't time changed you at all?" John asked. "She deserved it. Besides, I don't need counselors," Michael replied gruffly. "I agree with Michael. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Anne interjected. "Shut up. You're so pleased you spoke your mind today." John looked at Anne with annoyance. "All right, spit it out. Why did you come here?" "I'm guessing it wasn't out of love for your cousin," Michael asked, and the men went out onto the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Helen was crying hard in her room. Her feelings were overwhelming her, and now they were bursting out. She realized that she still loved John. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, John and Anne stayed the night. Helen realized this when she caught John having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early hours of the morning. "Hi, will you join us?" John asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancée." "I'll have tea in my room," Helen replied. "Your room? Are you and Michael in separate rooms?" "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's any of your business," Helen sneered, and taking the cup of tea she had prepared, was about to turn round and leave when she felt John grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Helen stared silently into his eyes, in which she was sinking by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed. Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened." Helen's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What nonsense? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your surname." John stopped talking. "I don't believe you," Helen sighed. "Especially now it doesn't matter. You don't love him now, and you're unhappily married. It doesn't concern you. You made your choice back then." Helen pulled her hand from his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed. Her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed it would burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Caroline's number and told her everything. "What do you think you're going to do?" she asked her friend. "I don't know," Helen sobbed. "I don't know anything. Maybe you should tell him he's having your baby." Caroline had been privy to the secret for a long time lately. She was the only person Helen could share it with. The girl, sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why should he know that? "Perhaps Anne will soon give him her children," Helen replied sadly. "Don't worry, we'll think of something. Besides, your father has promised to sort things out and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous in your condition. It's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Helen down a little. That day she decided not to go downstairs. And the next day there were no more guests. Time passed, but the father could not yet sort things out. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Helen was very worried. She never saw John again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. Michael looked at her as if she was nothing, and sometimes snapped at her, picking on every little thing. On the due date, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Mary after her mother. When she looked at her, she gasped. The baby was an exact copy of her father, even the mole on her left cheek inherited from him. She was met from the maternity hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Mrs. Kate and Caroline. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. Michael came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son, an heir." "And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, Michael? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What kind of heir are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. He was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. A girl wasn't part of my plan," he shouted. "You don't have to worry. We'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence," Helen replied as calmly as she could. Michael laughed and pushed Helen against the wall. "You're wrong," he whispered. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his trousers and you and your bastard, I suggest you think twice." "What's all this for?" she asked, barely breathing. "In time you'll find out. Be patient, my dear. But I'm warning you. Don't do anything stupid. It could hurt Daddy, or Nanny, or our little girl." Michael laughed wildly. The baby cried. Helen rushed to comfort the baby. She was stunned. She realized that Michael was crazy. And now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. She realized from the conversation she had had with him that he would not be supportive. He was clearly not well. As usual, he asked her to be patient a little longer. On the occasion of the baby's birth, Michael organized a party. All his friends were invited, and John and Anne. The party was taking place in the living room on the ground floor, so Helen preferred not to go down to the guests, for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a minute. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was John. "May I come in?" he asked timidly. Helen nodded silently. John walked over to the cot and looked at the baby girl. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Helen's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which John looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Helen repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you. You're even more beautiful now," John said affectionately. Helen could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the door, Anne's voice sounded. "You have to go now," Anne said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again." "At least I'd like to," John said quietly and went out. A fortnight later, the little girl was ill with a fever. There were no other symptoms. The girl screamed all the time. The antipyretics were almost ineffective. "Could you call a doctor, please?" Helen asked. "You don't need to bother your husband. It's just a cold," Michael assured her. "Please, the baby's not well." You can see that she begged. "All right. The doctor will be here tomorrow," Michael replied indifferently. All evening the girl was fussy. By nightfall, Helen realized that it was more serious than she had thought. The girl's lips had turned blue, and the attacks of suffocation caused wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Helen dialed John's number on her business card. "John, please help. My daughter is dying," Helen shouted into the phone. "I'll come over right now and call an ambulance. Hurry, please." Helen couldn't find a place to go as she hastily gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby. She rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. John arrived at the same time as the ambulance, having ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. Michael didn't come out to the noise, apparently sleeping very soundly after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked John when he and the professor came out of the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect." "Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," Helen answered with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course." "Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," said the professor. At that moment, the phone in Helen's pocket rang. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the receiver husband. "My daughter needs help, and I, as a mother, will do everything I can to help her. We're not coming home to you again. I'll file for divorce myself." Helen said what she'd been wanting to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. I'm the father of the baby. and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you." "You wouldn't do that." "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to come back. Otherwise, you'll see," Michael said and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Helen felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. John picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. When Helen woke up, she smelled the pungent odor of ammonia. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. John nodded silently. "We need to register the car under someone else's name and surname. Otherwise, he'll find us," Helen said. John didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Helen stayed close to her daughter the whole time the operation was being prepared. She only left to wash or eat. John was always there too. He knew that Michael was looking for his wife all over the city, but did not tell Helen. The most important thing now was the outcome of the operation. The girl was operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. John assisted. Those few hours that Annie was in the operating theater seemed to Helen an eternity. And only when John said that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Helen was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into John's arms. "Annie is my daughter, isn't she?" he asked Helen, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pulled her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reporting a major fire in one of the houses in an upscale neighborhood in the city. Helen was horrified to hear her father's address. He had died in the fire, suffocated and unable to escape. Mrs. Kate was badly injured and was in hospital. Helen rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson, for the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Helen. "It was from your auntie. I opened it, don't swear, but it must have been necessary, because it was burnt. And I read it your aunt had been seriously ill lately, and her soul was longing to see you. She rang many times. Only Mr. Sam Smith forbade her to see you. Said she shouldn't mess with her head. Well, she sent me a letter before she died. No one but me ever saw it. She bequeathed the house in the village to you. She asked you not to leave it, and at the end she wrote, 'I hope you will find true happiness at your source,' said Mrs. Kate, and closed her eyes. Helen cried quietly. Suddenly she saw through the window Michael's car in the car park. The girl rushed down the corridor, looking for an emergency exit, because John was waiting for her in the car. "Hurry, he found me," Helen shouted, and the car whistled to a stop. In the mirror, she could see Michael's Jeep following them. "God, he won't spare us now." "John, please," she pleaded. Michael caught up with them. One more spurt, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, a logging truck was in the oncoming lane and Michael's car slammed into it at full speed. John and Helen were sitting in the waiting room. "He wants to see you," the nurse announced. Helen entered the room where Michael was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. "My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started," he whispered. "Why do you hate me so much? What have I done to you? You are his daughter and you should have suffered, just as I did when, before you were born, he met my mother. I was a little boy then. He tamed me, and I loved him. And so did Mum. Then he met your mum and easily threw us out of his life. Mum couldn't take it and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All the while I was plotting my revenge and following his life. You were born into wealth, you had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing at all, you know." Michael looked at Helen with contempt. "So I set out to succeed, to destroy your family. And I almost succeeded." Helen did not listen anymore, silently left the room. Michael survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was cared for by Caroline, Helen's friend. As it turned out, Caroline had long been in love with Michael and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Helen, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to talk Michael out of his devious plans. A month later, Helen and John were taking their daughter home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home, the village, the one that had bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots. From lack of money, Isabella got a job as a maid to a millionaire widower. And when she saw her own face in the photo T4. Isabella Swan sat in the city park and cried bitterly. For the first time in her life, she was in a situation from which she saw no way out. After all, it seemed that not so long ago the girl was absolutely happy and dreamed of how soon she would get married and together with her beloved husband could create a real family. Unfortunately, Isabella's dreams were not destined to come true. On the contrary, the fairy tale quickly turned into a real nightmare for the young modest girl. Now, finding herself alone with the harsh reality, Bella was not only left completely alone without any support help, but could not even remotely imagine what awaits her in the foreseeable future. And it all started a few months ago when Isabella, having celebrated with her best friend her 23rd birthday, was returning home late at night from a nice cafe, recently opened in the neighborhood where Bella lived. Anne, a friend of the girl, offered to call a taxi for her, but Bella refused. They had already spent a lot of money in that fancy place. Isabella was strict about that. She tried to save on such things, allowing herself to arrange even such small holidays only on special occasions. Bella, let me call you a car after all. Anne insisted. Look at the clock, it's 11 o'clock. It's dangerous to walk in your neighborhood at this hour. Don't, she said with a smile. I've lived here for so many years, every dog knows me. What could happen here? And it's not that far. It's only a couple of blocks. If you're after money, I'll pay for your trip myself. You're stubborn, Anne said and started tapping something on her phone. I don't want anything to happen to you on your birthday, Bella. When she saw that her friend was about to leave the address for the taxi, Isabella gently covered the girl's hand with her own palm. Anne, she said in a quiet but insistent voice, don't. It's just a waste of money. Let's not try your Ben's patience. Her friend's eyebrows went up in surprise. What does Ben have to do with this? That's why he gives me the money, so I can have a good time with my friends. He's generous and understanding. Anne laughed, remembering her fiancé. He worked for a large construction company and was paid more than enough to fulfill the every whim of his charming, though sometimes a little capricious bride. I know that. And that's why I'm asking you again, don't call anyone. I'll walk myself. Let's call again tomorrow. With these words, Bella kissed her best friend on the cheek and strolled leisurely towards her house, enjoying the warm spring air on the way. When the girl's house was only a couple of 100 meters away, a large sports car suddenly pulled up beside her. The window of the driver's seat slid down, and a young man, whose face was dotted with small scars and pimple marks, looked unpleasant in appearance. Beauty, why are you walking alone? Are you bored? Don't you want to have a good time with me and my friends? The guy tried to simultaneously smile languidly and shout over the loud music playing in his car. The result was a pathetic picture. No, thank you, Bella replied briefly, trying not to look at the unpleasant major. What do you mean, no? He was surprised and turned to someone who sat in the passenger seat. Have you heard, men? This girl refuses to keep us company. Well, wait. The car, which until that moment had been slowly following Isabella, finally stopped. Bella realized that things were worse than she had expected, and so she quickened her step. But at that moment she was blocked by three tall guys who jumped out of the sports car. "Where are you going, beautiful?" one of them asked. "You're doing wrong. You can't offend decent men like that. We came to you with an offer, and what are you doing, turning your face away from us?" Isabella boldly looked all three of them in the eye, giving them a disdainful look. "Who else would talk about decency here? I told you I don't want to go anywhere with you. Let me through now." "Or what?" one of them asked, smiling wryly, nudging his mate. "Or you'll complain to your boyfriend, or maybe to your husband. I don't see a ring on your ring finger. And a normal bloke wouldn't let you go out alone at a time like this. So don't be a wuss. Just get in the car." The girl choked with indignation, not immediately finding something to say to such a blatant insolence. "I'm going to call the police and scream," she finally managed to say. And at that moment Isabella felt the steel embrace of someone's cold arms close around her. She turned round and saw over her shoulder that she had been grabbed by a pimply-faced boy major. "Help!" Bella shouted as hard as she could, pushing the rest of the air out of her, but was instantly kicked in the throat by one of the muscular scoundrels. "Worry as much as you want, if you can," he grinned. "Nobody can hear you here anyway. And if they did, nobody would care. You know how our people are. If a girl screams in the courtyard in the middle of the night, it means she's a shallow fool who can't be calmed down by her boyfriend. Should we put her in the boot?" "No, it's not interesting that way." Shook his head negatively, shook the head of the guy who was the most powerful physique. "Let's get her in the saloon, and me and the men will help you." The huge ambo picked Isabella up by the legs, while the second opened the door and the third helped the major and his mate shove the girl into the car. No, please don't. Help," Bella shouted. But she could only manage suppressed wheezes. Her stomach still ached from the impact, and her lungs felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs at once. Just as Isabella was about to say goodbye to her life, imagining in advance how it might end, police sirens suddenly sounded behind the company. Maybe a patrol car was passing by and heard me, the girl thought hopefully. "What's going on?" "Guys, the cops are coming. Let's go," shouted the leader of the thugs. And immediately his grip on Isabella's legs loosened. "Seriously, what are we going to do? Do we take her with us or not?" the major asked in horror. He, too, was confused and had not expected that anyone could see them in such an inconspicuous courtyard. "Leave her," shouted the head jock. "Anyway, she's a wretch, and we won't get any pleasure from her. Consider yourself lucky." Then Bella was roughly shoved out of the car, and the company of scoundrels fled in an unknown direction on their sports car. The girl's heart was beating as if ready to break through the chest and jump out. The unfortunate Isabella experienced such a powerful attack of fear that she was not immediately able to rise to her feet. Her hands and knees trembled and she gasped for air, but she felt like a fish thrown on the ice. For a second she clenched her eyes tightly, trying to calm down and stop shivering. And then someone on her right asked her sympathetically, "Girl, are you all right? Do you need any help? Should I call an ambulance?" Bella looked where the voice was coming from and saw a young man with glasses and a leather briefcase under his arm. He was looking at her with interest while checking something on his phone. Intercepting her gaze, he explained. "The sirens are just a ringtone sound," the guy explained. "I saw that those bastards were going to take you away by force, so the only thing I could think of was to switch on the police siren." "Where did you go?" Isabella asked, looking around for the police, but of course she didn't see anyone. "So no one is coming here then?" "I'm afraid not," the guy shrugged and leaned over Bella, holding out his hand to her. "Let me help you up." Dazed Isabella accepted the help, and the young man, gently holding her by the waist, helped her to the nearest bench, and then gently sat down. "My name is Michael," he introduced himself. "I'm sorry if I didn't stand up for you with my fists. It's just that I don't have the physical fitness to deal with 4 men at once. And I had to act fast. Bella looked at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude. What are you saying? On the contrary, I am incredibly grateful to you for your resourcefulness. You saved my life. If not for you, I could have been taken many kilometers away from here and probably killed. Isabella couldn't help crying in front of a stranger, the effects of stress. Nothing to be done about it. Please don't cry. Michael tried to calm her down. Would you like me to walk you home? I'm sure you live around here somewhere. Yes, thank you, she said, wiping away her tears. I'm sorry I'm not bothering you with this. You probably need to go home. You're off work. Bella nodded at his briefcase, but Michael smiled good-naturedly. Yes, my boss had to call me in on my own day off. As always, it was necessary to do something that could wait until Monday. The girl smiled back and gave him her hand. Isabella. It's a pleasure to meet you. As strange as it may sound, I'm very glad you were called into work today. The boy laughed and shook her hand. Me, too. Well, let's go. And they walked the remaining distance to the girl's house. On the way, they didn't talk about anything else. But just before they drove up, Michael asked Isabella for permission to meet with her again, to make sure that she had come to her senses. Sure. Let's meet at Main Street Ice Cream, Bella suggested. I love ice cream. Great. Michael responded and smiled a charming smile that gave Isabella butterflies in her stomach. It was surprising and pleasant at the same time. The girl decided that another meeting with this cultured guy would definitely do her no harm, especially since they seemed to like each other. That night, Isabella was not immediately able to sleep. Too many conflicting emotions raged inside her, paralyzing fear and humiliation from the scumbag story. But at the same time, deep in her heart, she felt a warm sympathy for Michael, who had saved her. He was like a knight on a white horse, only fighting not with a sword, but with his own wit and ingenuity. This turn of events excited Bella, and she looked forward to the next meeting with her new acquaintance. And she was eager to get to know him better. A couple of days later, at the appointed time, the guy and the girl met near the cafe. Michael looked great in his light blue light shirt and light linen trousers. A light beige jacket was elegantly thrown over his shoulders. Isabella was dressed as feminine as possible, a dress with a cherry blossom pattern, light sneaker shoes, and a soft ash pink shawl. The girl had arranged her blonde curls in a beautiful high hairdo, so that the image turned out to be very festive, though simple in execution. When they sat down at the table and the order was brought to them, the couple talked. Bella told the guy about herself and waited with interest for his reaction. She knew that she probably didn't look like any of the girls Michael knew. Fortunately, the guy's reaction was quite positive. I can't believe you're seriously working at a newsagent's? He asked with a slightly enthusiastic smile. Yes, I'm not kidding, Bella answered him cheerfully. I love selling people fresh newspapers and magazines. I can't help it. Isabella laughed. Michael looked at her with undisguised admiration. Then I have to tell you, with 100% responsibility, that you are the prettiest press saleswoman I have ever bought my favorite newspapers from. They both burst out laughing, and then continued their heart-to-heart conversation. Bella felt as if a stone had fallen from her soul. She was very worried that, having learned her place of work, Michael would not want to continue to communicate with her. But it turned out to be exactly the opposite. Well, I'm just an analyst for a financial company, Michael said, fixing his glasses on the bridge of his nose. My job is boring numbers, indicators, but it pays a lot more than teaching. Wait, I don't get it, the girl said. So you taught high school? In college, but not for long, Michael answered her. I soon realized that pedagogy was impossible without a true vocation, and so I decided to trade the walls of the student body for the stuffy office of an analyst. The guy sarcastically raised his eyebrows, letting the girl know that he did not regret his professional choice. "And what about your family? How did they feel about your decision?" Bella ventured to ask him about his loved ones. "Isabella," Michael's face immediately took on a grim expression. "I'm from the orphanage. I'm sorry, but I don't really want to talk about it. Do you understand?" Bella nodded. "I'm an orphan myself. My mom died 3 years ago. Unable to cope with oncology, we just didn't have the money for the expensive treatment the doctors insisted on. I miss her very much." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Her heart was filled with familiar pain and longing. She missed her mother terribly, though enough time had passed that, as they say, time had healed the wound. Michael shook her hand with feeling. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "Bella, you really are the most amazing girl I've ever met, so beautiful and so..." "What's that?" With excitement in her voice, she asked him again. The boy was silent for a second, choosing words, then smiled. Human, simple, but in a good way, he hastened to add, "You know, all the girls I know at work are like bright birds. Spectacular exterior, but inside there is an absolute emptiness. Sometimes it seems to me that they don't work for their careers, but for walking around in their new outfits every day in front of the whole office." Bella laughed. The bad thoughts instantly vanished like smoke. Michael portrayed his colleague so funny that the girl could not hold back a sincere, good-natured laughter. After the cafe, she and Michael went for a walk along the seafront. From it opened just a superb view of the river. They talked for a long time, discussing all sorts of things with each other: what kind of literature they liked, who and what they liked in the cinema. Isabella, who had been working at the press kiosk for several years in a row, was a remarkably well-read girl. On her modest salary, she regularly bought the most popular novelties of modern literature. The girl had an excellent knowledge of English, German, and so-called Scandinavian prose, and she really had a lot to talk about and discuss. Michael and Bella had a lot in common, so the first date was followed by the second, and the second by the third. Just a month after meeting, young people officially declared themselves a couple. The girl's work did not embarrass Michael at all, and he was happy to meet her in the evening after closing her small kiosk. "Isabella, I've noticed that you get one of those good-looking guys every time you visit," her work partner, Mrs. Mary, told her. "Is he your fiancé, suppose?" "No, not yet. Anyway," Isabella said, blushing to the roots of her hair. Mrs. Mary was a middle-aged woman who had worked at their kiosk recently, but Bella didn't like the way she sometimes looked at her. Mrs. Mary was definitely jealous of her youth and her desire to live, no matter what. While her partner herself had long ago become disillusioned with men and her own dreams of a better future. "Watch carefully, Bella," she warned her partner. "He's too sweet, not your fiancé. He could easily deceive you. You'll have a lot of tears to wash away." Isabella looked at Mrs. Mary in all seriousness and spoke clearly so that she could distinguish every word. "Don't worry so, Mrs. Mary. I can manage my life and my men without your help. My private life has nothing to do with you." Mrs. Mary only grinned unkindly. "Oh, girl, I'm trying to help you. In a motherly way, I'm warning you. And you're throwing a stone in my teeth." The woman waved her hand at her young partner. "That's how young people are now. You want to them as best as possible, and they in return you and snap back." "Let's finish checking the names," Mrs. Mary asked Bella. The girl wanted to change the unpleasant subject as soon as possible. She also wanted to finish her work quickly, so that she could go to another meeting with Michael. So 2 months passed, during which Bella felt absolutely happy. The girl lived in an old one-room flat, inherited from her mother. And here they often met with Michael, who sometimes even stayed with the girl for the night and on weekends. Michael himself explained to Bella that he rented a flat in the city center with one of his acquaintances. Because of this, he could not normally invite his beloved to him, He did not want unnecessary questioning on the part of his mate. The relationships between young people were becoming more and more serious, and Bella waited for a long time that Michael was about to make her an offer. However, this dream of hers was not destined to come true. One evening, the guy came home to Bella in an extremely depressed mood. When asked what happened, he reluctantly replied, "Problems at work." He slowly stretched out, but immediately added, "Don't worry, it's nothing serious, just standard work stuff." Isabella looked at her lover with undisguised excitement. "Can I help you in any way?" asked the girl, who was just cooking in the kitchen and trying to put together a delicious dinner for her lover. The oven timer beeped loudly, informing her that her favorite dish, baked chicken, was ready. "Oh, here comes the chicken," she said, pulling out a hot baking tray and placing it on the table. "Michael, don't worry about work. I'm sure it will all work out somehow," Isabella said. "Wash your hands and sit down at the table. Dinner is the best cure for the burdens of the day. That's what my mom used to say." Bella smiled, and Michael gave her a faint smile in return, then lazily wandered off to the bathroom. Bella felt that something serious had happened. It was just that her lover didn't want to talk about it. A little later, when they were already sitting at the table, she managed to find out the reason for such a bad mood of the young man. "I'm sick of all this," Michael threw his fork on the table. "If you only knew how tired I am of going to this damn office every day to work for my stupid boss." "Quiet, Michael. Don't shout like that," the girl asked him. "Can you explain what's wrong with you?" Michael looked at her with his beautiful light green eyes instead of answering. He looked pale and somehow haggard. God, what could have upset him so much, Bella wondered to herself. "I'm tired," Bella the boy answered her simply. "Tired of the fact that no matter what I do, I'll remain a mere analyst. A small fry in this world. Really big money that I may never have to see." Isabella looked wistfully at her lover. "Is it really that bad?" "Not at all," Michael exclaimed. "That bastard Black, my boss, only does that to pester me every day. He's not satisfied with my results." The guy shook his fist angrily in the air. "And what do you want with such low sales? Is it my fault your managers don't do anything?" "It's like this every day, Bella. Every single day this year, it's all about draining everyone else. And he only gave us a pay rise 2 years ago. And that was by a few pennies. God, how tired I am of it. I'm sick of it." Michael hunched over and wrapped his arms around his head. "God, Michael, calm down, sweetheart. Don't be like that." Isabella stroked his back. "Why didn't you tell me before about how bad it was for you?" "I didn't mean to upset you," Bella the young man said. "You're the best thing in my life. How can I put my problems on you?" Bella felt her heart beating harder at the words of her beloved. "You're an important part of my life too, Michael," she answered seriously and looked into his eyes. "That's why we must learn to share everything with each other, both good and bad. Only trust will help us to keep our relationship, trust and love." Michael froze for a second, then put his arms around Bella and kissed her tenderly. "You are the most incredible, sensitive, intelligent and understanding girl in the world, Isabella. I love you." Bella smiled and snuggled against Michael's chest, then asked him in a quiet voice, "If you can't bear to be in this job, maybe you should look for another place. I'm sure that such an excellent specialist like you can find a decent place with a good salary." Michael only sighed heavily and pulled away from the girl. "Well, if it could make a difference, honey. But in every place like this, the same story will repeat itself every time. I'll be working. The others, the ones that came in on the take, will at best do nothing and get the bonus I'm entitled to, and at worst they'll just ruin the whole business. But why do you care so much?" Bella couldn't understand him. If the company goes bankrupt because of the short-sighted actions of its top managers, won't it be their problem? What could be your problem? Michael began to pace her small kitchen. Bella, honey, you just don't understand. If I had a business like this, I would make sure that every employee within my staff was in his or her place. Then I could run things myself, manage the process. We could get married and think about buying our own big and spacious house, having kids again. Cause, what can I give you now? Nothing. I can't do that, Bella. I have to think about tomorrow. I'm a man, after all. Michael went to the window and stared thoughtfully at the silhouettes of the high rises on the horizon. Isabella didn't know how to help her lover in such a situation, so she only asked, "What do you need to start such a company yourself?" The answer pleased her at the same time, but also upset her. Everything is banal. My beloved money, everything, and always rests on them. Except I can't even get a loan. I don't have anything to pledge to the bank, and the interest rates are crazy. I don't know if I can pay it back. A thought slowly began to form on the periphery of Isabella's mind. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but she seemed to have an idea of how she could help her favorite guy. What if you had a co-signer with collateral who could put in a good word for you in case of emergency? Would you be approved for a loan? Michael turned round sharply, and in his eyes Bella saw a fierce glimmer of hope mixed with uncertainty. "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, it would greatly increase the chances of success." Bella bit her lip, considering her actions and words. Of course, she was willing to do anything for Michael. A loan wasn't such a big deal after all. Michael would put the money to good use, and with his integrity, persistence, and intelligence, he'd be lucky. He will definitely make a brilliant businessman. She was sure of that. "Michael, then consider that you have such a guarantor," Isabella said decisively. "I'm willing to help you with a loan if it will help your dream come true." For a second she thought her lover's eyes flashed with a strange fire. But Bella thought it was probably just a figment of her imagination. Still, the decision of the surety was extremely serious, and the girl could not help but worry, thinking it over. "Isabella, my girl, my angel. Are you sure you want to do this?" Michael asked her, taking the girl by the shoulders. "You just don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's not like I'm insisting. I'm just sharing my thoughts with you." "Oh, honey, don't," she reassured him. "I'm doing this for both of us, for our future together." On Michael's lips played a beautiful, but a little sly smile, as if the guy had already decided everything for himself. Bella thought then that it was, of course, about their house together and the creation of a family. "You won't regret it, I swear to you," he assured her. "As soon as I open my own business and we get the first profit, we'll apply for a marriage license. You'll be my wife, won't you?" Michael asked with a smile, just in case. "Are you still asking?" "Of course, yes," exclaimed a happy Bella and hugged her lover tightly. The next day Michael returned from work, unexpectedly earlier than usual, and immediately rushed Bella, who had that day off. "Bella, honey, I've already arranged everything. My friend advised me a great bank, where the interest is low, and the guarantor can easily become a guarantor. All you have to do is bring your passport and the deeds to the flat." "So soon?" The girl was amazed. "Michael, maybe you and I will choose a bank together a little later. Let's see what other options are available." On the face of her lover ran a subtle shadow of discontent and irritation, but he held back, saying aloud as affectionately as possible, "What to expect, beloved? Suddenly they have such a unique offer with a limited period of time. Now we'll miss it, and that's it. We can consider the idea a failure. The sooner I get the money, the sooner we can start looking at our own place. Don't you want that? And the wedding? I don't know about you, but I'm going to celebrate it to the full." "Only nobody has given us any money yet," the girl tried to reason with him. "Honey, please, let's make this decision together. It's all happening too fast." Michael was increasingly difficult to contain his irritation, so he came to the girl and hugged her by the shoulders so hard that Bella involuntarily shrieked. It seemed to her that Michael's usually so gentle fingers suddenly turned into steel pincers. "Ow, it hurts, Michael. What are you doing?" The girl shrieked at him in surprise. I'm sorry, he immediately released her. "It's just that I'm so nervous about this whole loan thing. I want to realize all our dreams as soon as possible." "I understand," my love, Bella nodded. "I just want everything to go right, to be sure that this bank is reliable." Michael made a resentful face and lifted his chin. "Well, if you don't trust my lawyer friend, then. Remember, you were the first one to talk about trust." The girl finally sighed and agreed. "All right, let's follow your intuition. Wait for me a minute. I'll just change." Half an hour later, they were on their way to the bank branch, where, having shown the specialist all the necessary documents and waiting for the decision of the commission, Michael received his loan, and Bella became his guarantor, offering as collateral his flat. As soon as Michael's account was the coveted amount, the young man immediately began to tell Isabella about his grandiose plans. According to his assumptions, they will have to close the loan in just 6 months, if the idea, which he has been hatching for years, will be a success among his fellow investors. "I've made some connections while working in this stupid office," Michael shared with his beloved, "and a couple of investors have even agreed to listen to my proposals. Only for this I will have to leave the city for a while, purely for work issues related to production." Michael continued to share his plans. "Wait, you mean you're leaving?" Isabella looked at him in surprise. "But why? You don't have a concrete plan for what you plan to do yet." "The business you told me about, of course, looks very tempting." But Michael, the guy, rolled his eyes theatrically. "No way, please. How many times do you have to pull me every time? Tell me, don't you believe me? Do you think I'm going to run away with this money and leave you all alone?" Bella's insides tightened. She couldn't imagine such a thing. She trusted her fiancé too much. "No, of course not, honey," she said, embarrassed. "Well," Michael continued, "the investors have privately agreed to take me in and show me possible areas where I can put my future equipment. Isn't that a decisive step in the direction of our dream?" Isabella smiled weakly at her fiancé. She realized that he was trying, as they call it, to strike while the iron is hot, but only in her soul she always had an uneasy light, when she imagined that she and Michael would have to be separated, even if only for a week. "Promise you'll call me every day?" Isabella asked him. "This is the first time you'll be away from me. It's not a test. I'm just worried." Michael ran his hand gently over her face. "I'll not only call you, I'll text you every day," he smiled affectionately. "You'll see you'll get tired of me." They spent that evening together. Michael was with Bella, very caring, tender, and the girl felt herself on the 7th heaven from love. There was no one in the world she could trust as much as her adoring fiancé. The young analyst explained to her that he would take a morning flight to another city, and from there to meet with one of the investors. The girl let her lover go without a second thought and started counting the minutes until his return. A couple of hours after Michael's departure, Bella's mobile phone rang, to her surprise. It was her immediate superior calling, and his tone was not at all friendly. "Well, Swan," he said sharply. "Excuse me?" Bella stammered. She really didn't know why the boss would be so angry with her. She and Mrs. Mary had closed the last shift more than well. There had been no shortages. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" shouted the warden. "It's a shame that Mrs. Mary was so worried about you, so protective of you, and you stole from us, you scum." Bella stood in the middle of her small living room and flapped her eyes in confusion. Bella felt as if everything that was happening was not happening to her, as if she were watching some low-brow show on TV. "Mr. Sam, let me come over here now, and you can explain everything to me," she asked. because I don't know what happened in there, but I'm sure there's some ridiculous mistake. You'll come, the director grumbled on the other end of the line. Yes, of course you will, and you'll pay me back the whole debt, like a sweetheart, so that you'll be there in an hour. Do you understand? Bella said goodbye briefly and began to pack. In less than an hour, she was already in the office where Mr. Sam Smith, the branch manager of their press kiosk, was sitting. Entering the office, the girl, to her great surprise, found her partner there as well. Mrs. Mary looked tired and anxious, as if she had been up all night. But when she looked at Bella, her eyes were filled with hatred. "Ah, here you are." The headmaster started from the doorway and locked the door behind her. "But please explain, where did you put 40,000 of the proceeds?" "What?" Bella almost choked with indignation. "What 40,000? What are you talking about? I gave the cash to the collectors the day before yesterday." "Yeah, Mrs. Mary's a witness. We counted it all together." She, however, threw up her full hands in resentment and shook her head. "Bella, let's not do that. Don't involve me in your machinations, please." "What machinations?" "Mrs. Mary, you saw me handing over the bag to the collectors with your own eyes." To her amazement, her partner began to sob, and then cried and put a handkerchief to her eyes. "Why are you doing this to me, Bella? Have I ever treated you badly? I'm a grown-up woman. You might say I'm in my 5th decade. Am I going to lie to Mr. Sam? I didn't see that amount of money packed in that bag. That's a fact. What you put in that bag, I have no idea." Mrs. Mary continued to sob. Bella didn't know what to say for herself. There were no cameras in that kiosk. The boss himself had been greedy. He hadn't spent any money on installing them, relying on the honesty of his female employees. And now it turns out Bella was accused of stealing. "Don't you have anything to say to that, Bella?" Mr. Sam asked her, suppressing the anger in his voice. "I trusted you so much. I mean, you've been with us since you were 19. You're like family. And now this betrayal. You live and learn. You can't trust anyone in this world. No one." Bella could barely suppress the urge to cry right here in the office of her boss. She really truly loved this job. After graduating from school, when it turned out that her mother was ill, the girl did not waste time on education and immediately got a job at this kiosk. They paid here correctly every fortnight. And only this money allowed Bella's family to stay afloat at a time when her mother could not physically work as a cleaner in the local school. "Mr. Sam, I swear to you that I had nothing to do with stealing that money," Bella repeated stubbornly. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Mary grinning into her handkerchief. Bella realized that she had been set up. "So you don't want to give me that money back, do you?" The boss reached for the receiver of the old telephone. "All right, Bella. Then let the police deal with you. After all, you're neither my daughter nor my niece to mess with." "Wait a minute, Mr. Sam," Bella exclaimed in despair. "But let me work the money off if you like. Take all my wages for the next 2 months, but don't call the police." However, the boss only shook his head negatively. "No, there's no way I can allow someone like you to work in my kiosk. Money, of course, from your salary deducted, but so be it. Take pity on you, foolish. But don't go on the next shift. You're fired." At that moment, the girl thought she'd gone deaf. Fired? How could she be fired? She'd worked at Rospechat for so many years. The whole kiosk and every newspaper in it was like her own. However, choosing between dismissal and forfeiture of 2 months' wages or prison, Bella chose the latter. When she and Mrs. Mary left the office, the girl turned to her former partner. "Why did you do this to me, Mrs. Mary? What have I done to offend you so?" The woman squinted angrily, but a victorious smile played on her lips. "You shouldn't have been always happy and cheerful, as if you didn't work in a kiosk, but every day as if you were going out on holiday. You should be more modest, child." And then the partner contemptuously looked at the girl from head to toe. All those workplace affairs you're having. I've always disliked them. Look at that redhead showing off. No face, no skin. All those suitors chasing after her. No, just a little bit at a time. Maybe life will teach you that you should conduct your affairs modestly and not poison others with your happiness? Bella stood dumbfounded, looking at Mrs. Mary. She had expected anything but this. "So you were jealous of her, were you?" she asked, tears streaming from her own eyes. "Out of ordinary female jealousy?" Mrs. Mary just waved her hand, saying, "Don't be dramatic," and then she added, "You can't prove anything anyway. And I need that money more. I've wanted to go on holiday to the sea for a long time, but I couldn't get the money I needed." "Be glad you got off so lightly, you fool," said Mrs. Mary. "I've been working in shops for years. A mouse like you would be a piece of cake to deal with." With these words, Mrs. Mary looked round, and making sure that no one could hear them, walked quietly and leisurely away in the direction of the exit. She felt as if she had really just been dumped in the mud. Unable to contain the storm of warring emotions any longer, the girl stepped out into the fresh air and decided to call Michael. She realized that it must have been a short time since he had boarded the plane. By now, her fiancé must have just checked into the hotel. But she could not wait any longer, and, having dialed the cherished number, she was ready to hear her dear and beloved voice, when suddenly, instead of her fiancé, she was answered by the operator's dry mechanical answering machine. "The subscriber is switched off or is out of the network coverage area." Isabella Swan glanced at her wristwatch and frowned. By all plans, Michael should have landed by now. An uneasy feeling crept into her heart. Had something happened to the plane? Bella remembered what Michael had said about his flight and called the airport. And when a polite employee explained to her that the flight she was asking about did not exist, Isabella, having lost her balance abruptly, fell to the floor without feelings. When Bella regained consciousness, no one was around. Luckily, she hadn't been lying there long, so at least she hadn't been cleaned out. But who was she kidding? She'd been cheated, it seemed. In one of the most sneaky and lowly ways possible, they had invaded her trust to help her apply for a loan. The girl found it hard to believe that Michael could run away with the money, depriving her of essentially everything. There was nothing to pay the interest to the bank. She had no job. That meant her flat would be taken by the bank very soon. Isabella didn't want to accept what was happening. It seemed that her whole life, which had been going well, was shattering like a crystal vase that had fallen to the floor. The girl, for the next few days, without ceasing, called Michael, but each time she answered the operator, claiming that the number of her fiancé out of network. Most likely, Michael has just thrown out the SIM card and now happily hiding somewhere with a few $1,000,000, which so successfully divorced the poor girl. For Bella, however, remained a mystery, whether the cunning analyst really saved her then from the bandits or it was all a carefully thought-out plan. "Well, I guess I'll never know," she thought sadly to herself, and deleted Michael's number from her phone book. For the next week, Isabella Swan was in a terrible state. The last time she had felt this bad was after her mother's death. She wanted to call Anne first. Surely her friend wouldn't judge her. Perhaps she could help her think of something to do with the money. But Bella was too proud for that and didn't want to pressure her best friend with her problems. And then the girl saw in Anne's social networks that she and her fiancé flew on holiday to some distant warm islands. Isabella saw this as a kind of sign, saying that she is destined to pass this difficult test alone. Then Bella began to look for a new job. Here she received an unpleasant surprise. None of the little or even decent firm did not want to see in its staff a person without education, whose only experience the sale of press. No matter how erudite Bella looked at interviews, the answer was always the same: "I'm sorry, but you are not suitable for us." In the end, despairing, the girl opened a newspaper of free adverts and there unexpectedly saw an unusual vacancy. The country house required a maid with the functions of a carer. The patient was an elderly businessman who, due to illness, could not serve himself. Bella thought that she could help this man, because she took care of her mother when she was ill. And the fact that it will be necessary to clean the house, so it's nothing. The salary in the advert promised a very decent salary. So the girl decided to try her luck and called the number given. The next morning, a big black SUV with beautiful license plates picked her up. Bella immediately realized that it was for her, as the day before she had agreed with the manager of the businessman that she would be brought to their mansion. On the way to the mansion, she met the businessman's driver, John Carter. The kind, cheerful chap immediately put Bella at ease. He told his young passenger funny anecdotes and at the same time taught her how to behave when meeting with the businessman. "You, the main thing, Mr. Tom Brown, do not be afraid," John Carter admonished her. "He is generally a very good man. Only his fate is not an easy one. His wife died a couple of years ago in a car crash. He's been on the wane ever since. And lately there's a kind of sadness in his eyes. He needs moral support, someone to be there for him all the time. Why don't you call a professional doctor for him?" Bella asked. "He doesn't want to," John said calmly. "Of course he has a doctor who visits him from time to time. But Mr. Brown himself doesn't like it very much. All those white coats, the smell of medicine, they make him nervous. But I warn you, I've got a bit of experience too. I've only looked after my mum, so I only know the basics of medicine." "Somehow I think that will be more than enough," the driver answered her and smiled. When the girl was brought to Brown's estate, that was the businessman's surname, Bella opened her mouth involuntarily, seeing the scale of the whole plot. There was a rose garden and figures of trees, and even something that she had seen before only on the pages of magazines, namely a small-shaped labyrinth made entirely of greenery. And the businessman's mansion itself was truly astonishing to the imagination of the average person. It resembled a small medieval castle, only equipped with all the latest technology and cameras. "Just amazing," Isabella exhaled, looking at all this splendor. "Yes, this house is very impressive when you're not used to it." John stood next to her. "When I first got a job here, I couldn't believe for a week that I could live in such luxury. But then I got used to it." A little later, the manager scrutinized Bella's personal file and, to her luck, decided that she was quite suitable for them. Another day was needed to move to the millionaire's mansion all the things necessary for the girl, after which she was fully ready to start work. The girl was taken to the office for domestic staff, where they gave her a uniform and explained her duties. Bella listened very attentively. The last thing in the world she wanted was to accidentally forget something in her long list of daily chores. "Good morning, Mr. Tom Brown." She said a shy hello to her ward as she was led into his room and introduced to the businessman. "I'll be helping you now." Mr. Brown was a man paralyzed from the waist down who looked to be about 65 years old. His pleasant, noble appearance inspired Bella with some confidence, though her heart was shattered after the story with Michael. Isabella now saw a catch in everything and was afraid to trust men, even in small things. She realized that it was foolish to lump them all together. Mr. Brown looked at his new maid and smiled. "Your name is Isabella Swan," he said, looking curiously at her fiery red hair. "Yes, that's right," she answered, a little embarrassed. "I applied for a job with you. I was told by the manager that you needed an ordinary man for this position." The millionaire continued to look at her with obvious interest, so that the girl involuntarily became uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, wheeling up to her in his buggy. "Bella, may I ask you an indiscreet question?" Isabella felt herself blushing, but nodded in agreement. "Is your hair naturally this interesting color?" At that moment, Bella's mind began to think that this old rich man might like her not so much as a carer, but as a woman. Fortunately, it turned out not to be so. "Yes, it's my natural color. My mom had the same color." For a second, Bella thought that a slight shadow of alarm ran across Mr. Brown's face, but she wasn't sure. The businessman answered her nothing but offered. "Will you play checkers with me? Can you?" he asked with a slight slyness and winked at the girl. "Of course, I don't like to play chess, but checkers is always welcome." Bella smiled politely and began to arrange multicolored checkers on the board. The maid and the businessman played 3 games at once, after which it was time for a massage and helping the man in a number of other procedures. Fortunately, the girl did not have to do Mr. Brown's bathing. The businessman had a special person from among the domestic servants for this purpose. When all the procedures were finished and Mr. Brown lay down to rest, Isabella decided to tidy up the room. She gathered some things and was about to wipe down the bookcase, when suddenly a loud female voice came from downstairs. "Where's Daddy?" "What do you mean he's sleeping? This is actually my parents' house. I can come when I want. You shouldn't have come," Isabella heard a few minutes later. A strikingly beautiful young woman burst into the room like a whirlwind. It seemed to Bella that before her stood a real supermodel, which she as a child so fond of looking at for hours on the pages of old library magazines. "Daddy, I'm home." "Oh, who the hell are you?" she asked Isabella rudely, and looked her over from head to toe with a frankly snobbish, contemptuous look. "Caroline, calm down. This is my new maid," said Mr. Brown in a hoarse voice. "Isabella, please meet my daughter Caroline." "How do you do?" said the girl, her voice trembling with excitement. But Caroline only turned away, throwing her through her teeth, dismissed. Isabella did not immediately realize that the rich woman was addressing her, but when she looked at her over her shoulder, she quickly left the room. She could still hear Caroline snorting unpleasantly at the door when she was distracted by Mrs. Emma telling her that dinner for the domestic staff was ready, and everyone was already gathering in the staff kitchen. A couple of hours later, when Isabella re-entered Mr. Brown's room, she thought the man looked somehow too pale. "Mr. Brown, what's the matter?" "Are you ill?" Bella asked excitedly and cautiously approached his bed. The man was silent in reply. Something incomprehensible flashed in his gaze. Bella thought that there was something wrong with his heart. She took his blood pressure just in case, and when she saw that the numbers on the display were very high, she rushed out of the room and downstairs. "John. Mrs. Emma. Somebody. Help," she called out. "What's the matter?" asked the butler, followed by the housekeeper. "Mr. Brown's not well. His blood pressure's off the scale. His heartbeat too," said Bella. "Oh God, not that," Mrs. Emma spluttered. "He's having another attack. John, I'll call a doctor. You drive up to the gates of the village. Show the paramedics the way so they can get here quicker. Don't leave your master until the paramedics arrive. Do everything you can to keep him unconscious." Bella nodded and ran back out. When she ran out into the room, she saw that the businessman's skin was already beginning to take on an unhealthy color. In addition, he was shaking as if he'd been electrocuted. Isabella took some ammonia to his nose and put a soft, double-folded handkerchief in his mouth so that the man would not bite his tongue in a fit. God forbid. The girl pinned him to the bed with her hands as hard as she could. 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived at the millionaire's mansion. The man was promptly relieved of the seizure, and the doctor, looking at Bella, only sadly shook his head. "The attacks have been getting more frequent lately," he said. "We'd like to take Mr. Tom Brown to the hospital, but he's absolutely against it. Stubborn. We've controlled the seizure and given him sleeping pills, so he'll sleep for a few hours. After that, hopefully he'll feel better. It's good that you were there for him. At times like this, it's important to have someone who cares and knows a little first aid." "What is his illness?" the girl ventured to ask. "We're not sure ourselves," said the doctor uncertainly. "At first we thought it was epilepsy. Seizures damaged the cerebral cortex, hence the paralysis of the limbs. But now it's too ambiguous to be certain." It could very well be a tumor that we have no way of locating. So the prognosis is not good at all? Isabella asked sadly. I'm afraid that's something I can only discuss with family members. You are just his carer, replied the doctor, looking sadly at the millionaire. I think we should all prepare for the worst soon. After the doctors left, Mr. Tom Brown's face regained its natural blush and color. Isabella decided to see which of his prescribed medicines the man had taken last. It might well be that Mr. Brown had an intolerance to one or more of the components of a particular drug, and then much would be clearer. In the process of checking the prescription, she found a strange blue jar at the bottom of the chest of drawers without any identifying marks. There was nothing like it on the list, and it seemed a little suspicious to Bella. She opened the lid and looked inside. At the bottom were several bright red pills, the purpose of which remained a mystery to the girl. Bella asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Emma, about the drugs, but she couldn't give her a clear answer, saying that all lists are strictly controlled by Brown's doctor and his daughter. The medicines are very expensive, so Caroline regularly brings her father everything he needs from the list herself. Isabella, being a kind but fair-minded person by nature, was determined to find out what this medicine was all about. While Mr. Tom Brown was unconscious, the girl read to him classical works of Russian literature, Pushkin's poems, and something from Spanish drama. The man had been asleep for over 10 hours. While putting another volume on the shelf, Bella accidentally elbowed some green book, and it fell to the floor and opened in the middle. Clumsy, she scolded herself, picking up the book. But then she noticed something that made her squat down and fall forward on her knees. An old photograph the size of a small postcard had fallen out of the book. Isabella picked it up and turned it over. At the same moment, the world around her shook, and her eyes darkened sharply. "Mum," Isabella whispered, looking at the photo. The picture was indeed Bella's mother, only very young and beautiful. Isabella recognized the photo immediately, for she had a small silver pendant in the shape of a heart hanging from her chest. One half of it opened if the pendant was pressed lightly. Inside was the exact same photo, only scaled down by a factor of 3. But how could this be possible? Bella asked herself, shifting her gaze from her own photograph to the one she had found in the book. The maid decided not to ask the businessman anything for the time being, as he was already having a hard time. When Caroline arrived the next day, she was in tears as she clung to her sick father's chest. "Daddy, how did you frighten us all?" She spoke in what seemed to be a deliberately loud and false voice. It seemed to be done so that everyone in the house could hear her lamentations. "Come on," Mr. Tom Brown patted her on the back. He had regained consciousness and was beginning to talk and move around in his wheelchair again. "Tell me how your new fiancé is doing. When are you going to introduce him to me?" Caroline smiled so broadly that it looked as if her cheekbones were about to collapse. A little later, she answered, "It's so sweet that you're interested in everything that's going on in my life. Soon, my beloved and I will surely come here together to ask for your blessing. But you get well first, because I pay such a lot of money to these idlers, and they bring you to a new attack." At the last words, Caroline looked at Bella and John Carter, who were standing there, with such an angry look that it seemed that the beauty had one wish in her heart, that Bella and the businessman's driver would turn to dust right here, right in front of her eyes. "So these fellows, on the contrary, did their best to save my life," said Mr. Tom Brown. "Especially Isabella, a very good girl. Don't scold her." Caroline gave Bella a look of pure fury. Then she kissed her father on the forehead and said, as if nothing had happened, "All right, let them live for now. Dad, I'll go then, because I have to go to our office, some things with your partners to solve. You don't mind, do you?" On the face of the millionaire blossomed a benign smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm just happy that my business has such a worthy successor. Tell Mr. Harper not to rush into another deal. We'll have to see how those Chinese behave." Mr. Tom Brown and his daughter Caroline discussed some business matters, after which Caroline sailed past Bella like a swan across the surface of a night lake, leaving the room. The maid, however, was determined and slipped after the beauty into the corridor. "Wait, please, Caroline," she asked the girl. She stopped half-stepping and turned slowly to Isabella Swan. "Are you talking to me?" she asked, stretching her vowels. "I think you're the only one here. I was checking your father's medication the other day, and I found a strange vial, blue in color, with no labels or inscriptions. It had red pills inside." "So?" The heiress raised her head. "Do you know what kind of medicine it is? It just wasn't on the list. And I think Mr. Tom Brown is allergic, maybe to some drug." "No, that's out of the question," Caroline exclaimed and flung her finest silk scarf over her shoulder defiantly. "I personally buy all my dad's medication. And what you're describing are, just so you know, very expensive vitamins from Germany. They are sold by the piece. That's why I put them in a separate vial, so as not to mix them up." "Huh," said Bella. "Vitamins, then? Then all the more reason to have them analyzed. Maybe there's some exotic ingredient in their composition that could provoke such a reaction? I've heard that expensive vitamins can have some pretty—" Caroline interrupted her with a regal wave of her hand. "I don't have time to listen to any more of this nonsense. Everything I bring my father is the best, and there can't be any reactions there. After all, what am I reporting to some maid? Go scrub the floors. Or don't you have anything else to do?" Bella decided not to poison her soul, and with a short nod went to the kitchen. However, as soon as she left the estate, Isabella Swan crept cautiously into the garage to John Carter. "John, can I talk to you for a moment?" the girl asked him. As the guy approached her, Bella whispered, afraid that someone might hear her. "I have a huge favor to ask of you. Would you mind driving me into town tomorrow? I want to take something to a private clinic for analysis, and I wanted to borrow some money from you to pay for the examination." John smiled and winked playfully at the girl. "What's that? Then, what's the drive?" Bella shifted from foot to foot, but finally decided to share her suspicions with the driver. "This may be completely crazy, of course, but I want to check out Mr. Tom Brown's vitamins, the ones in the blue vial. Something tells me they're not that helpful." John immediately became serious. "I've worked for Mr. Tom Brown for a long time. I can safely say he's like family to all of us here, and I'll do everything I can to make sure he gets better." The next morning, Bella and John went to the clinic, covering themselves with the excuse that they were going to the supermarket for some of the products that the owner of the mansion asked Bella personally. The girl really hoped that during these few hours of absence nothing fatal would happen to him. Isabella Swan had been looking after Mr. Tom Brown on her day off anyway, and had spent some time with him before leaving, following all the instructions of his attending physician. When they arrived at the laboratory, Bella gave the specialists 3 red pills, after which John Carter still paid them extra for the speed of the examination. Eventually, after several hours, during which the driver and the maid had indeed visited the shop and bought groceries, the lab technician who conducted the tests came out to them with the conclusion in his hands. His face was extremely puzzled. "Where did you say you bought these vitamins?" he asked, looking at the papers. "In Germany," replied Bella calmly. "Why, is there something wrong with them?" The medic's face darkened in an instant. "If in Germany patients are prescribed heavy psychotropic drugs as vitamins without a prescription, then I think it's time for me to leave medicine. It is absolutely forbidden for a normal, healthy person to take such a cocktail." "Are you serious?" John couldn't help himself. "So you mean that it's not even additives?" Bella was astonished to the core. She leaned lightly on John's shoulder to keep from falling. "Never before in my life have I encountered a situation like this. Tell me, what exactly can happen to a person if they take this for a long period of time?" the maid asked, There can be many variations, said the doctor. But in the vast majority of cases, it is paralysis of consciousness. Some of the signs of epilepsy are possible, but in the end, it always ends with the death of the patient. God, thank you, doctor. She thanked the laboratory assistant and, taking from him the document with the conclusion and expertise, hurried back to the millionaire's house. Do you realize what this means? She said to John on the way home. Mr. Tom Brown has been deliberately poisoned with these pills. All the symptoms of Brown's illness are exactly the same. The driver looked worried, as did the maid. But there was a look of doubt on his face. It is, of course, astonishing, but just. Who would want to do such a thing? I tell you, everyone in the house is very fond of the master. I think the answer is obvious. Caroline buys all the drugs. Besides, she's admitted to me herself that she thinks those awful things are vitamins. She also lied to me about Germany. I don't quite understand why a daughter would poison her own father. Then John couldn't take it any longer and pulled over. Parked on the curb. Bella. There really is something to this. Caroline, she's not related to Mr. Tom Brown. Brown married her mother when she had a child. That was Caroline, only 5 years old at the time. So Mr. Tom Brown adopted her. Oh God. Isabella understood. Now that her mother was dead. And there's no telling what kind of accident it was, maybe not without her involvement. And she's decided to eliminate her stepfather too, so she can take over his company. Why? I mean, she's already running the place pretty well. We must inform the owner as soon as possible. The young driver nodded and started the engine. God forbid she should realize that you suspect something. She's a very cunning woman. When they reached the mansion, it was discovered that Mr. Tom Brown had had another attack, and a couple of hours before, his favorite stepdaughter had been in the house again. The doctor who examined the businessman came to a disappointing conclusion. I'm afraid our Mr. Tom Brown won't survive another one of these attacks. And there won't be any more, said Isabella resolutely, taking out the vial and showing it and the report to the doctor. This was the cause of Mr. Brown's illness. Mr. Tom Brown will recover if he is not given these substances. The doctor looked at the pills in amazement and then read the report. But that's a drastic change. We need to call the police. We don't have enough evidence, said Bella. And we can't disturb Mr. Tom Brown now. But there are other ways of approaching it. A few hours later, Mrs. Emma, the housekeeper, rang and, unable to hold back her tears, asked Caroline to come. Caroline, please come right away at once. Not a minute. Your father is dying. Yes, he is. He's been sick again. The doctor said it's over. Caroline rushed in almost lightning fast and entered the house with a stride as sure and firm as a true mistress might enter a mansion. Where is father? What is the matter with him? Said the beautiful Harris menacingly. John then very politely escorted her to Mr. Tom Brown's room. He was lying unconscious under a drip, but he looked quite weak. The very life seemed to be draining out of him. Leave us alone. Caroline angrily ordered John, then slammed the door of the room right in front of the driver's nose. Father? Caroline spoke softly as she approached the dying businessman's bedside. Really? Have you finally deigned to leave this world and spare me and your business from your perpetual grousing? The pretty girl took a chair and sat down next to her stepfather. A gloating smile blossomed on her face. God, who knew how long I've waited for this. I can't believe how happy I am. You know, I was starting to worry. Why aren't my pills helping you finally get off your feet? Turns out all you had to do was wait a little longer. Well, you'll go feed the worms, just like my mom, who never had enough money. And me. I'll finally get down to the real business and make our company, no, sorry, Father, my company proud of the whole country. No exaggeration. At this heartbreaking moment, The door of the room opened and a police investigator appeared on the doorstep with an open crust. "Who are you?" Caroline exclaimed. "What do you think you're doing?" The investigator walked unceremoniously up to the young woman and with a loud snap, handcuffed her wrists. "Now, if anyone will recognize you, it will be your cellmates," the policeman said with a smile. "Major Wilson, Detective Squad." "How dare you?" She was indignant. "I was saying goodbye to my terminally ill father. You disrupted our last meeting. How despicable. That you tried to poison the man who gave you absolutely everything in this life," Bella said sternly, following John and the housekeeper into the businessman's bedroom. "Fortunately, we were able to save Mr. Tom Brown from your monstrous pills. He's asleep now. But as soon as you are where you belong, namely in prison, your foster father will be immediately transferred to the best clinic where he will be properly cared for, and where you won't get to him." John threatened her with his fist. "God, I'm glad Mr. Tom Brown didn't hear any of that," Mrs. Emma said quietly, and put her handkerchief to her eyes, which were already full of tears. "It was so good that it was all over at last. Yes, the most important thing is that he is safe now." Bella nodded, smiling at her. Mr. Brown was transferred to a private clinic, where he was immediately given all the necessary treatment to remove, or at least eliminate as much as possible, the effects of the pills that had been poisoning him, as the test showed for almost 2 years. It took a long time for the man to recover, but he was still able to return to his usual life. Although the businessman could no longer walk fully and now moved with the help of a graceful cane, he was still glad that he could move on his own. When he was told of Caroline's betrayal, the businessman remained silent for a long time, unable to utter a word. It had wounded him to the very heart. However, he was still immensely grateful to Bella and everyone else that they did not leave him to his fate, helped the elderly businessman to save the most important thing he still had, his life. In gratitude for his rescue, he helped Bella close all her debts to the bank. Bella had to tell everything, as she could have lost her flat at that point. Wealthy businessman Mr. Tom Brown connected all his connections. The millionaire calculated that Michael at that moment was abroad in Greece, and he managed to arrest him. He cheated another, this time very wealthy lady. Later it turned out that the young man for many years has been engaged in a similar dark trade. So Bella wasn't his only victim. And what was Isabella Swan's biggest offense? The guy really did plan their encounter in advance, only he thought it was Anne, the girl's rich friend. He must have got it mixed up. And then he thought the wool from the lousy sheep. Now he was waiting for a long prison term. And he will have a chance to think about how many unhappy women he deceived, and how many fates he broke. Bella continued to work at the businessman's house. She became friends with John Carter, and later their sympathy grew into something more. John was completely different from Michael. He was honest, genuine, and most importantly, he loved Isabella for who she was and didn't try to use her for any dirty purposes. As for the photographs, Isabella once plucked up the courage to ask Mr. Tom Brown, "How can it be that my picture and the picture you have in one of your books are of the same woman? Is that your mum?" The millionaire asked her in amazement, studying the photograph in his own photo. "Wasn't her name Patricia by any chance?" "That's right," she nodded. "Did you know her?" Mr. Tom Brown shuddered and sank slowly into his chair. "Is that what it was that caught my eye about you the first time we met?" he said slowly. "You look just like your mother. Especially the hair. You see, Bella, I was very fond of your mother once. No, not really. Patricia was my first and only love, the woman I wanted to spend my life with." "What happened? Why didn't you do it?" the girl asked him cautiously. "Everything is simple to the point of banality," sighed the businessman. "My parents were so against our marriage that they forced me to leave Patricia and go to England to study. They wanted me to marry a girl from a powerful family and set a condition, either a life with Patricia, but in poverty because I'm disinherited, or the opportunity to continue the family business. And you chose the second, Bella clarified. Yes, I chose family and money, said Mr. Brown sadly. If you only knew how many times I regretted that decision. But it was too late. Your mum must have taken offense and left town for good. We lived in another state when we were kids. That's true, Bella confirmed. But then we came back. Mum had always lived very poor, and it was always hard on her. She died of cancer. She was in a lot of pain. When the millionaire looked at the girl, there was an inexpressible pain in his eyes. A few moments later, however, he suddenly asked, Bella, do you know who your father is? No, the girl answered simply. Mum never liked to talk about it. Once, however, she said that he was an unworthy man, but that's all. At that second, Bella began to understand what Mr. Brown was getting at. No, she said slowly. You don't think that? The elderly businessman fell to his knees in front of her. Bella, please let me do a paternity test. What if you're my daughter? What if my Patricia left me a blood heir? Isabella Swan, though completely confused by her feelings, still agreed. The next day they went to the clinic, where they did all the necessary tests, and a few days later the paternity of Mr. Tom Brown was confirmed. He was indeed Isabella's biological father. Apparently, when he left for England, his beloved was already pregnant, and not having time to tell the happy news to her fiancé, who left her, ran away to another city. My darling daughter, the elderly businessman hugged the girl and at the same time covered her face with kisses. How happy I am that fate has brought you to me in my old age. Daddy, Bella whispered back, unable to believe the miracle. Of course, Isabella forgave her father for the offense he had committed in his youth. Times were different then. And Mr. Tom, to some extent, was also understandable. The girl was sincerely glad that now they had found each other again, and that she had such a wonderful family after all the hardships that she had to endure because of Michael. 6 months later, Bella married John Carter. Father approved the candidacy of a young and faithful driver, in gratitude making him head of security in one of his banks. John was very happy about this. He loved Bella, and he loved Mr. Tom like his own father. And now it turned out he was his father-in-law. But isn't it a miracle, the lad thought sometimes. John honestly performs his duties and is considered one of the best employees of Mr. Brown's company. The wedding was lavish and beautiful. John and Bella spent it outdoors, surrounded by loyal friends and huge floral arches, hung with bright garlands. It was a magical wedding, which the girl remembered for the rest of her life. And 3 months later, Bella gave her husband the most desirable gift in the world, the news that she is expecting her firstborn. John, all the pregnancy, looked after his wife, as no man in the world would not do it. In any case, so thought Bella herself, taking from her loving husband another bunch of favorite grapes. After the due date, they had a wonderful baby girl, which the couple decided to call Mia. Parents are very hopeful that the grandfather will have time to see her wedding, while Mr. Tom is constantly fiddling with his granddaughter and considers her the most beautiful woman in the world after his daughter. There is still a lot of time ahead for this family, and they will enjoy every day they have on this earth.